whatever thou art, stay away. Soon, I will be consumed by them, by the dark. Surely mankind are more than pure dark. The spread of the abyss must be stopped. All of you, forgive me, for I have availed nothing.
Hello everyone, this is Aegon of Astora, and welcome back to Dark Souls 3 Let's Talk Lore. This is episode number 12, being recorded on Friday the 17th of March. I hope you're all having a fantastic day, whenever it is you find yourself watching this. So, I don't know that we're ready to talk about the old Wolf of Farron just yet. So we might leave that for a little bit. I should mention before we really get going that, and I know it seems like I do this every episode, I think because I probably do, but I should note that it's 1 a.m. I spent something like 6 hours teaching today and then another 3 or 4 grading papers. I'm exhausted, but I have a family function to attend tomorrow, and so I can't record as I was originally hoping to. So yeah, we're gonna see whether we can't record at least the first little bit of this episode in such a way that it isn't incoherent nonsense. So my sincerest apologies if it winds up being that way. But with that said, yeah, we came up here towards the end of the previous episode to get the Dream Chaser's Ashes, which we've already traded in because, as you can see, I'm using, at least the sword I'm using is new. I'm using the Great Sword, which someone pointed out in the comments to the previous episode and have not prepared any of the comments at this point. So I don't remember who it was, but I will discuss this comment in the viewer comments segment. But someone did point out that the size of the Great Sword, starting with Dark Souls 2, would seem to be a reference to Berserk. And I did know that, but I didn't bring it up because I don't really know all that much about Berserk. And in this instance, it was just more or less, yeah, I know this is a Berserk reference, or an apparent Berserk reference, but I just don't really have all that much more to say about it than that. So it's supposed to be the weapon of guts, as I'm led to understand. But in any case, yeah, that's the weapon we're using, and we've prepared several other weapons as well, but I'm actually not going to reveal those just yet. So hopefully the end result of that is at least mildly interesting to those of you who are interested in the gameplay aspect of this. So we have a very unique vantage point up here. We can see what I think, is that Karthus? I think that's the cathedral, in fact. But which part of it, I'm not entirely sure. Because, again, as we saw in the previous episode with the flame stacks that are on top of the flame altars, even though this too is a low polygon model compared to the actual model when we're down in Farron Keep, in the swamp proper, this too is a lower polygon model. But it's higher polygon than the one that we saw in Vort's boss room. And this one actually reflects the fact that the flames are out. So I suppose it's possible that the flames not reflecting whether or not we had extinguished them when viewing the area from Vort's boss room. I suppose that it's entirely possible that that isn't a continuity error, and that perhaps what we're seeing there is some sort of, a reflection of some sort of distortion of space-time as we know it in the real world, that is reflected in the fact that, this right here, that the high wall of Lothric is both literally and metaphorically a high wall. And yeah, so there's clearly something that's going on here that is beyond our comprehension of space and time. As we've discussed in previous episodes, most notably in episode 4, when, we discussed my treatise on the cosmology of Dark Souls 3. But I think it's more likely given the fact that when we're at Vort's boss room, we can observe two seemingly separate areas that are both the Undead Settlement. I feel it's probably more likely that we were just looking at a continuity error. But yeah, it is interesting, and that was one of the things I meant to check, so I'm glad we came around here. That, the flame stacks, so there's one, there's two. And is that 3, or is that 2? 1, 1, 2, 3. They're all 3 of them right here. They're all extinguished. But when we are up there, it doesn't appear as though that's the case. So again, this is also a lower polygon model of the high wall than that which we see when we're up there. And it's very clever, and I don't complain about that a lot, but it is very clever how they do that. The fact that we can climb down a ladder, and that in the process of climbing down the ladder, the area sort of redraws itself in a higher quality way. And it's something that, I've come to take for granted since having played Dark Souls 1 and realizing, wow, there's basically no loading screens if you don't die in this game. notwithstanding a couple of areas that you do need. So like going to Anor Londo, for instance, you're carried by the Batwing demons and it initiates a loading screen. When we go back to the Asylum, same thing with the crow that carries us there. The Painted World, we also get a loading screen when we go there. But I think that's it. Theoretically, you could walk through the entire game, save for those 3 parts, and not experience a loading screen. And obviously it's very different in this game and in Dark Souls 2 because warping in both games is available right from the start, and besides, it's not really possible to reach all these areas were you not to warp. Because, once again, it does appear as though there's some really hard to understand, hard for a human mind to wrap itself around the way time and space is distorted in this game. That right there is the Undead Settlement. Took me a second to figure it out, but yeah, so we get a nice little overview here. It's obviously different than the one, as I've been discussing for the last 5 minutes, it's obviously different than the one that we get when we are at Vort's boss room. But it's very interesting. I think we're going to leave the old Wolf of Farron for now, but we are going to return to it, of course. And up here again, we have yet another perspective from which to view the landscape. And a perspective from which, yet again, I believe we're looking at lower quality models once more. Although in this case, it does look like the model was checking to ensure that the flames, whether or not the flames had been extinguished. Because it is reflected once again from up here. I guess one thing is that maybe if it wasn't in fact a mistake, they probably just thought, well, the player's not likely to come back to this spot anyway, which is kind of hard to believe considering, I think we talked about this in episode 10, but the fact that FromSoft doesn't necessarily have a grasp or a firm grasp on the extent of the community that has sprung up around trying to make sense of these games and their stories, at least in the West. I'm sure they have a sense of what's going on in Japan, but because yeah, you would think that just based on things like the flames in the basement of the mansion in Dark Souls 2 in Majula, how, you know, players did all these different things to try and figure out what triggered the flames from going from yellow to blue, because some of the flames go to blue. I believe once the bonfire level reaches 8, or New Game Plus 7, for that particular boss. So yeah, so they've built things into the game previously, into the previous Dark Souls games, that would seem to reflect an acknowledgement of the extent to which players are exploring these games in great depth. And yet, yeah, there are instances where our exploration of the game, or at least the depth of our exploration of the game and its story, is impeded in some ways by things that are either blatantly not finished, or just really hard to wrap our heads around, or that we just can't make sense of at this point because we're missing some big piece of the puzzle. So I don't know which of those things it is, or whether it's a combination of those things. I would suspect it's a combination. This spot right here I always found incredibly interesting, because you can see the reflection of what seems to be a sun shining off the water. And it's beautiful. It really is a beautiful landscape. We see right over here mountains of what seem to be ash, that are very reminiscent to that which we find surrounding the Northern Undead Asylum in Dark Souls 1. And I would assume that that is not a coincidence, considering what we're about to witness. What are we supposed to be looking at there? Is that the Road of Sacrifices? Is it just not loading in properly? Or is that supposed to be a reflection? So again, as with the item descriptions last week, where I expressed some frustration concerning the apparent abundance in this game of simple typos and serious grammatical issues in some of the item descriptions, which really gets in the way of us attempting to unpack the item descriptions in a very precise, particular way, paying attention to the way things are phrased, and, you know, looking for key phrases and terms that will help us understand the items that the descriptions are attached to. So it could just be that, and in this case, it's the graphics that create such issues. It's not always clear whether or not the thing that we're looking at was intended, or whether it's just an artifact of the game having been released in a somewhat unfinished state. But yeah, we've discussed that enough, so let's move on. So this is the Stray Demon. And I'm kicking myself now for not having done the comments, because I read all the comments as they come in. Even if I don't read them in great depth, I skim them and then I read them again later. And I do recall Yosaho having left a comment which speaks to the nature of the Stray Demon, or which, you know, provides some additional context that the English item description doesn't. If we go back to episode 1, when I described Firelink Shrine, the name Firelink Shrine, as not being the name of a place that is meant to be the same place as in Dark Souls 1. Like, it's not a proper name, it's a descriptive name. It's a shrine where fire is venerated. I hope I'm using that word correctly. That the Firekeeper tends to the flame. The flame is the thing being praised. Just as the Cathedral of the Deep rose up around a cathedral to venerate the deep. And in this instance, if I recall correctly, again, I believe Yosaho described the Stray Demon simply as a demon that is stray. And it's possible that that is basically the same connotation that we were to take from the name Stray Demon in Dark Souls 1. But I think the implication there is that this is not meant to be the same Stray Demon, or one of the same Stray Demons from Dark Souls 1. And in thinking about it now, it's rather cleverly placed here, because as with the mountains that I was pointing to earlier, and as with, you know, things like the Nameless Night set and the context in which we find it, and the proximity with which we find it to other items that were similarly proximate to them in Dark Souls 1, we find the Stray Demon here, and we see that unlike the demon that we came across in the Undead Settlement that we fought with Sigvard, this one doesn't have any flame. There's no fire, it's just rock. And of course, after we defeat the Abyss Watchers and make our way through the catacombs of Karthus and down to the Smoldering Lake, we find down there that further evidence that the chaos has faded. That the chaos and that the demons it was producing are basically no more. They're a dying breed. So yeah, very cleverly placed in the world, in that it takes into account where you currently are, where you're going, and is sort of provoking you to think about these things, and to think, wait a second, like there's something different about this demon, other than the fact that it just phased its weapon through the wall there. It's not a demon as we knew them in Dark Souls 1. The demons were all about fire. Oh man, So that's definitely happened to me before. He's thrown me off the side before. It's going so well until I started talking trash. Oh no, I'm dead. I really pissed them off, didn't I? But I also looked up, I loaded up the translation spreadsheet that Yosaho provided, and I think this is an older version, but what it does say is that Stray isn't a name of demon. So I think that is saying what I was suggesting it said, and that is that Stray demon is more of a descriptive term, that here's a demon that is far away from its home. It's lost its herd, so to speak. But that's just, again, from the translation spreadsheet. I would need to look at the comments to make sure that he didn't write something more specific than that. But Firefox is a pain. I use Firefox primarily, Chrome sometimes too, but I try to keep it closed while recording just because it's such a resource hog, on my PC at least, and especially with the release of the newest version. Something about how it manages tabs, I don't know. But yeah, I try to keep it closed while recording so as to ensure that there are no frame drops. So in spite of the fact that we're, level 101? Yeah, level 101 thanks to the Memetim. Yep, we got our asses handed to us by the Stray Demon. So let's try that again, shall we? Rolled much too early. That's the attack I was looking for, friend. Keep rolling much too early for that attack. Oh no. Not again. Not again. Soul of a Stray Demon. Soul of the Stray Demon, one of the twisted souls, steeped in strength, used to acquire numerous souls or transposed to extract its true strength. The Stray Demon, now lacking even a trace of flame, was once the gatekeeper of Lothric. So, again, I don't understand why, like, I guess it makes sense that it was once a gatekeeper to Lothric, but at whose behest? Like, who, like, I guess it makes sense because but see, the thing that is really strange about this for me is that in Dark Souls 1, it wasn't the Stray Demon that was the gatekeeper to Lordran, it was the Asylum Demon. So, what? Like, why? I guess, you know, Lothric isn't, of course, bound to repeat the conventions of Lordran. They can do whatever the heck they want. And, you know, in many cases they have. But I don't know, I guess maybe at the same time, maybe it's just a reflection of the broader theme of historical forgetting, and also of the extent to which we twist historical legacies to meet not only our present needs and aims, but also just that it's, you know, in large part, that's part of what history is. History cannot and should not be understood as a perfect reflection of the past. History must be understood as a very context-specific study of the past that depends in no small part, in fact depends entirely, on the availability of evidence. Evidence that would not have been produced equally all over the world and in every context and by every person, but also wouldn't have been stored equally, wouldn't have survived equally. So the history that exists is the product of investigations conducted with various levels of rigor. So in some cases they're very rigorous, in other cases, again, they're just presentist documents that sort of seek to extend one's influence backwards, to claim the legacy of past greats as one's own. And this is all, of course, very relevant in the context of our forthcoming discussion of the Abysswatchers. And the legacy that they think they're living up to, that ironically, just like the original legend, just like the legend of Artorias, even though they were supposed to be this brave and gallant knight that swooped in and saved the day, but in fact, we learned that it's not that simple. It is not that simple. And that not only did they not save the day, but they pretty much failed entirely in their goals and succumbed to the very thing that they swore to defeat. So, yeah, but we'll talk about that soon, obviously. So we have a Great Axe, which I think we might have gotten at least one of these previously. Great Axe resembling a hunk of raw iron. If one possesses the inhuman strength required to lift the weapon, the great heft of its attacks will send foes flying. However, since every swing makes use of one's entire body, attacks leave the wielder wide open to retaliation. Ember? We've dealt with that item description enough, so I think we can leave that one for now. Another Ember. Again, difficult to separate or to chart the respective places of each of the story reasons and the gameplay reasons for items being where they are, and generic items like Embers in particular. Other than, of course, in this instance, perhaps to suggest that a bunch of people have died, a bunch of Unkindled have died to the Stray Demon. That's perhaps the most obvious story explanation for those being there. I don't know about the Great Axe. I think we can get that as a drop from the hollows that use it in the High Wall. So it's interesting that they would put that there, even though, yeah, it's a weapon you can get the drop from elsewhere. But, yeah. So a lot of just looking around in this episode, and I assume that just as I did in the previous episode, I'll probably cut a good chunk of it out. So again, not to belabor the point too much, but we see here another example of something that is seemingly unfinished, or just, you know, a graphical oversight, or a glitch. But in any case, you know, we're several versions into the game's life now, about a year, in fact, I think, into the game's life, which is crazy that we're only on episode 12. Sorry, everyone, but yeah, real life has been tough. But whatever the case, you know, we're looking at another spot where it's like, oh, well, that certainly makes it more problematic to try and draw meaning from the things we see at a distance in this game. Not in all instances, but in some, yeah. Like, obviously, you're not necessarily supposed to be looking down there, but you would think that FromSoft would know by now that this is the 5th Souls game released, that there's going to be a bunch of people looking for anything that they can find to give them a better idea of what's happening in the game. And if with such regularity you find things like this, it can be a little bit jarring. And again, I'm not complaining. I love Dark Souls 3. I think Dark Souls 3 is fantastic. And I couldn't have conceived of a better way to do Dark Souls 3. I honestly couldn't. I think that they did an incredible job of making this a meaningful sequel that expands and enriches the first 2 games in a way that so few games are able to accomplish. And by so few, I mean almost none. So they're definitely to be commended, but that isn't also to say that we can't criticize things when we see things that deserve to be criticized. And again, I think it's worthwhile to not just point the finger at FromSoft, at the developers, and say, oh, well, they're just lazy, or they're money grubbing, or incompetent, or anything like that. We also need to understand the political economic context for why things wind up unfinished and broken in some ways, and in some instances. And in this case, I think it's pretty clear that Namco Bandai, especially given their recent efforts to reach out to other developers and encourage other developers to make Souls games. And when I say Souls games, I mean, I understand Souls as being both a genre and a series, including both Demon Souls and Bloodborne in the series and the Souls genre. So there's two separate things. I still have yet to make an Aegon Rants video about that, because those videos take a really, really long time to do. Probably twice as long as an episode of Let's Talk Lore, but they're only watched by like 1/10 of the number of people. So this series is obviously where my priorities are. Not as a result of that, but just because, this is the series that I think is the most unique that I have, and that, since it involves interacting with all of you and doing this in a very collaborative fashion, this is the series I enjoy doing most. I enjoy the video essays as well, but again, they're just very laborious and often quite contentious. Not that this series isn't contentious for some people, but... So crystal lizards in this game are another game mechanic that I think is used quite well to draw the player's attention to things. But we saw it earlier on with the first glimpse that we got of the deep on the Road of Sacrifices. No, it was at the end of the Road of Sacrifices, at the entrance to the Cathedral of the Deep, where we found, two crystal lizards which led us down a side path that ended at the deep. But so I think it's really clever how they use crystal lizards in Dark Souls 3, and just sort of the environmental design in general to draw your attention towards certain things. And it would seem that in this case, oh, there it is. And it worked. It worked completely. Even though I was just trying to explain what they were trying to do and how they were trying to coerce the player into doing something, as soon as I saw the crystal lizard, it's just Soul's instinct. I just ran right for it. I'm like, oh my god, it's gonna get away, it's gonna get away. It completely worked. I 100% fooled by that. Just as I was explaining my awareness of them doing that. Oh, bravo, FromSoft, bravo. Okay. So obviously they want to draw your attention not only to this, but also to this. This is the spot where we met Yoel of Londor, and we had several comments dealing with this dragon here, /drake /whatever. I've already forgotten where we landed on the terminology there. I recall GSF noting that the Japanese text includes designations for the different types of dragons, like there's flying dragons and yeah, that's the only one I remember is flying dragons, but I can't recall whose comments they were. It might have been Scholar of the Worst Game. But yeah, we had a comment from someone who was very adamant in suggesting that this dragon was frozen in time. That it wasn't petrified, but that it was frozen in time. And I can see the merits of that now, a little bit more than I could when we were on the other side of the bridge. Not only because of what this comment pointed out, and again, I apologize, I don't remember who left it, because that was like 4 months ago. But they pointed out that not only is there basically no debris in the gap between these two bridges, and what's more is just looking at this here, the dragon looks different than the petrified dragons that we find in the High Wall. I want to say that the petrified dragons we find in the High Wall are gray, and I also want to say, but I don't know if I've ever looked in their mouths this closely, but I want to say that the dragons there don't, because like you can see the tongue of the dragon and the teeth. So again, keeping in mind all the things we discussed, we've discussed up to this point in this episode about not knowing whether the things we're looking at are necessarily supposed to represent the things that they appear to represent. In some instances, it could just be more evidence that the game was released in a somewhat unfinished state. There are some things that are just broken and don't work, or places where the things are supposed to represent something that they don't represent just because the designers didn't have enough time to implement the original design. But yeah, like, that doesn't look like the inside of a mouth that is petrified, of a creature that is petrified. I would imagine that the tongue and the teeth, just like the rest of it, would be petrified. There's also what appears to be fur, but again, very, very low quality, these textures, so it's hard to say. But it does appear to have fur in the same way that the Ancient Dragon does in Dark Souls 1, in Ash Lake, the one who leads the Dragon Covenant in that game, but also like the Storm Drake that the Nameless King rides, the King of the Storm. That was a very hairy dragon. So yeah, not really sure what to think about this. Once again, I almost went running for the Crystal Lizard, not even realizing that I already killed that one. So we have the Dragon Crest Shield, a knight's shield engraved with a crest depicting a dragon. One of the enchanted blue shields, the Dragon Crest Shield greatly reduces fire damage. So, in Dark Souls 1, we find this shield. I believe we find this shield together with the Astora sword, although in that game it's called the Astora Straight Sword. We find those in front of an undead dragon in the Valley of Drakes, which, though it's very close to Firelink Shrine, it's hard to say how far the Asylum is from where Firelink Shrine is. But I don't know. Again, I don't know. I'm just mostly, again, thinking out loud, trying to wrap my head around all of this, but... And this one's meant to troll you into waking that guy up. So we're not going to fall for it. No, it didn't work. No, they're sleeping! Oh, you bastard. Oh. So, another example of just the weird things in this game. Although in this one, it's one I like a whole lot. That is, if you're not actually looking at an enemy, for some reason it doesn't track their vertical position. So, I've said this before, I put it like this too, where if you're having trouble with an enemy in Dark Souls 3, just look away from them. And then if you turn around, they'll have to sort of fall from the sky if they're gonna give you any trouble. So, based on the positioning of the pilgrims, we can see, of course, that they're all traveling towards Lothric, which, you know, isn't news. We learned that in the introduction to the game, in the intro cinematic. But we can also see that there were so many pilgrims making the pilgrimage to Lothric that they got split off into several different groups. There's a group we find who made it to the Undead Settlement and no further. And then the Undead Settlement was once linked Presumably this was the Road of Sacrifices, but it's also possible that the Road of Sacrifices just ends at the Undead Settlement. And yeah, and then we got this poor guy all by himself right here. And I think there may be more on the other side. I just maybe didn't draw attention to them, but yeah, that's really sad. But it also shows that... Sorry, friend. It also shows that while these changes to the landscape were taking place, that it was a very, or at least I think it shows that it was a very sudden event. It's interesting that this is a very similar sort of structure to that which we find at the Undead Settlement right here. So that makes sense. Because it's basically the exact same structure.
I have any time.
Oh, hey, friend.
I have.
Yeah, you certainly do, man. You certainly do.
Any time.
And I appreciate it. It's been a long time.
I have any time.
I know. But yeah, thanks.
I have.
No, yeah, I appreciate you helping anytime. I really do.
Any time.
So yeah, it looks like it was just the one pilgrim. So I didn't think this would take an hour, but here we are. But I do very much welcome any thoughts or suggestions, further questions about the things that we've seen up there and all the things that I've been questioning over the last 50 odd minutes, but probably shorter for you because I anticipate I'll probably be editing a few things out. So the old Wolf of Farron. Ancient medallion depicting the crest of a wolf symbolizes the pact with the old Wolf of Farron. Equipped to pledge oneself to the watchdogs of Farron. The watchdogs ensure that the warriors sleep in serenity by taking the form of loyal spirits and hunting down those who would trespass the woods of Farron. Summoning takes place automatically while this is equipped. So again, we're looking at history repeating itself, but with slight differences, which, if you go back and watch my first ever series, Dark Souls 2 Let's Talk Lore, which I don't necessarily recommend you do just because the quality's not very good, and it's mostly a monologue. But if you go back and you watch that series, my understanding of how things changed from Dark Souls 1 to Dark Souls 2 is basically reflected in Dark Souls 3 as well. Is that I've yet to touch on a very interesting comment that AJ Sin left. And AJ Sin commented on episode 7, inquiring about how the cycles transition into each other. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that, because clearly I don't know the answer, but I really do love just using the plain rapier. It's great. But in terms of how the cycles transition into each other, I suppose it would depend very much on the extent of the overlap that exists in between worlds. And so, recall again in Dark Souls 1 that Solaire described not only the flow of time as being convoluted, but also that worlds come into contact with each other for periods however brief, and then they are no longer in contact with, like, there's a very tenuous series of connections that are made in between each world. So that's how we're able to see certain people in our world. So Lucatiel is an example I used the last time she showed up prior to this episode, was that after you sit at the bonfire, after exhausting her dialogue, clearly her world has shifted out of contact with ours. And so what that has to do with the answer to the question is just that it depends on where it is that you're standing. And so this is another issue that touches on my discussion in the earlier episodes of the fact that you can't achieve a one-to-one synthesis of gameplay and story because it's impossible for a number of reasons. Evolution by natural selection was the example I used, where over time a number of variations will emerge in any set of data that's repeated over and over again, such that an infinite number of things could happen. But at some point the developers have to pick a spot and say, this is where Dark Souls 2 takes place. And so for one reason or another, this particular arrangement is where they landed. And it's an arrangement that kind of contradicts the situated, context-specific nature of the lore by the very fact that there is even a sequel. But they've done some interesting things with it that, in retrospect, I think are much more original and much more artistic and thought-provoking than I initially did while playing this game.
And that is that the world that we're seeing is to some degree the result of thousands upon thousands, really an untold number of changes and actions, player actions, unkindled actions, chosen undead actions. That the world we're looking at is itself part of a multiverse, and it was produced through the aggregate actions of players and people from past history, but randomized in a way so as to account for the multiverse-ness of it. That's not a very good explanation, and I'm still trying to think that through, so that's part of the reason why it's so terrible. So I will most likely do sort of I'll revisit my treatise on the cosmology of Dark Souls 3 to try and wrap my head around that a little bit better, along with the rest of you out there. But yeah, again, this could be looked at from that perspective, that things, history seems like it's repeating itself, but the slight differences sort of reflect our inability to actually know history, to know the past as it happened. That it's the imperfections of history that are showing, as well as our collective tendency to lionize past heroes, to want to have these people from the past who are great and heroic and who we look up to and who did great things, even if the surviving history of them doesn't tell the whole story. And yeah, this is a prime example of that. Whoa. That is frightening. For a second I thought it was a hollow face. But no, that's the armor, the Exile set. I don't know that we picked it up. But we can look at it back at Firelink. Yeah, that's the Exile helm. Which of course was worn by the two watchdogs who were guarding the ladder leading down here. As well as the helm of the Abysswatchers. So that's a cool little detail I never noticed. I thought it was a head for a second, just because of the way the texture looked. I thought it was a head and a mask. but it makes sense. But again, we find something very similar in Dark Souls 1 surrounding what was ostensibly Artorias' grave, which was being guarded by the Great Grey Wolf Sif. We saw swords sort of poking out of the ground all over the place, indicating the people presumably that have fallen to Sif. So a sign to stay away because a lot of people have died here. And or offerings of respect and prayer from those who are venerating this wolf and its blood. But again, it could just be mindlessly an example of the extent to which the people in this world mindlessly look to history and try to repeat it and try to live up to the legends of the past, even though, you know, it's virtually impossible for them to do so. Because, yeah, we do have a gravestone here, or what appears to be a gravestone. I'm open, as always, to hearing suggestions to the contrary, or any sort of elaboration on what this thing might be, if it isn't a gravestone. Or even if it is, in fact. So yeah, it's a very similar setup to that of Sif, except of course when we come across Sif, he's alive. So yeah, I don't know. Let's go back to Firelink. So, I believe that the trigger for Cirrus showing up here again is us having handed in the Dream Chaser's ashes.
Hello again. I have since heard a great deal about you. For one, that you are most gentle of heart. I, too, am bound by duty, but can offer you my sign. I hear that cordial intrusion lays the path to embers. If I can be of help, by all means, do call upon me. Blessing of the moon upon your journey.
Same to you, friend. She is so cool. I love Cirrus. She is really, really cool. And nice, too. Very nice. At least until you trade a tongue, or you give a tongue to Rosaria. So I guess maybe not super nice, but she's nice. He's nice too, but his motivations are considerably more suspect, so...
Aha, thou returned, and a fine day it is. So, happened upon any twisted souls?
So we picked up the Soul of a Stray Demon, of course, which gives us access to Havel's Ring, a ring for warriors keen on heavy accoutrements. Increases maximum equip load. This ring was named after Havel the Rock, the battlefield compatriot of Gwyn, the First Lord. The art of war has been a constant since ages past, and those who would follow in Havel's footsteps are no fewer now than in his own day. So I can't exactly see. Again, I mentioned this in the previous episode too, just because I can't zoom in real time while recording this, but on the bottom, I imagine that those are all just rocks. And, you know, there's a thing with human perception that, you know, we're always trying to see faces and things. But I feel like one of the rocks on the bottom looks like it has a face in it. But I'm sure that's just unintentional. But really, really, like, I love getting to see the greater detail on these items that we had in Dark Souls 1 and 2 that, or at least this one was only in Dark Souls 1. So, somewhat of a pointless fun with definitions, but just for posterity. Accoutrement refers to additional items of dress or equipment or other items carried or worn by a person or used for a particular activity. So yeah, they liked heavy shields, they liked heavy weapons, that's what that's saying. So therefore they used this ring. Which I don't know why the soul of the stray demon would have it, unless of course someone using the ring died to that stray demon, which again is probably why we pick up 2 embers there, each on its own corpse, to suggest that many people have died to the stray demon. And if it was the gatekeeper to Lothric, so that suggests that this stray demon's been there for a very long time. Although, I suppose that does raise the question of how the heck did the pilgrims get by it, but yeah. So we also could have gotten the boulder heave, art of a stray demon of stifled flame, spews a boulder from one's mouth. The boulder is heavy, but shatters easily.
Now, do not be away over long.
Ah, well met, Ashen One. How may I be of service?
Iron Mask of the Watchdogs of Farron's Keep. After the Legion's Watchers became Lords of Cinder, the wolf blood dried up, and Farron was consumed by a festering wood. Within the wood, an emaciated old wolf commands watchdogs to defend the sanctity of sleeping warriors. Both the exiles were surely watchdogs themselves, for Farron has always been a land of itinerants. So itinerant meaning traveling from place to place, or a person who wanders or travels from place to place. So whether adjective or noun. And that is very consistent with, again, not only what we're seeing in Dark Souls 3, but what we saw in Dark Souls 1. Because in Dark Souls 1, it wasn't the Watchdogs of Farron, it was the Force Hunters Covenant, led by Alvina, who we also meet in the Abyss, for she leads us to... I don't know why she was there. Maybe she was following Artorias and Sif? But yeah, she leads us to an imperiled Sif. He is, and I made sure to include this video in the comment segment of the previous episode. So if you've not seen that in Dark Souls 1, then you will have seen it then, and you're going to be seeing it again now. That, yeah, she leads us towards an imperiled Sif who has a magic sort of force field around him as several humanity sprites are seemingly trying to attack him, or not necessarily attacking him, because it's complicated with the humanity sprites, because it appears as though it's not a purposeful action that they're doing. They're drawn to you because of the characteristics of the Dark Soul. And we'll explore that later on, but so whereas in Dark Souls 1 we had Alvina and the Force Hunters, which was made up of a bunch of NPC chosen undeads, who, surely enough, had various different starting sets. They were from various different places. So when it says here that Farron has always been a land of itinerants, that also applies to Darkroot Garden, where we found the Force Hunters Covenant in Dark Souls 1. So yeah, so both covenants and both area bosses seemingly serve the same point, although yeah, it's complicated. But yeah, we're gonna leave that for now.
Ashen One, be sure to bring more souls.
Something else I wanted to point out, just because I've never actually put this on before, so I never noticed it. But that's... Whereas, so again, another example of history repeating itself, but being slightly different. Slight variations in what is happening. And in this case, Whereas the big hat worn by Big Hat Logan was just worn to placate to his sort of antisocial tendencies. He didn't want to waste his time talking to people. He didn't want anyone fanboying or fangirling out around him. So he wore the hat so that he could hide his face and not talk to people.
Have you spoken to Master Logan? He is an accomplished scholar. The arts of sorcery would never have come this far without his contributions. And he has the nerve to go risking life and limb. What a stubborn old fellow.
I shan't stay here forever. You have great potential. Don't go and die over nothing.
Oh, hello again. I was waiting to tell you. Master Logan has returned, and he tells me that he has you to thank. Well, we are both in your debt now. Thank you, sincerely. He's just over there. Go along and have a chat.
But with the Crystal Sages, for whatever reason, they have some very strange... It's almost like the Plague Doctor mask that was worn by Eileen the Crow in Bloodborne, but it looks much more like it's actually the skin of a crow. So that is very, very interesting to me. But yeah, I just thought I would point that out. I'm sure that many of you are probably already aware of that, but that was the first time I had ever tried it on, so a few weeks ago, that is. But anyways, moving on. So we are here for two different reasons. The first of which is to have a look at that dragon over there. Getting wrecked by high wall enemies at level 101. Hi friends, don't mind me. No, no! Stop it. We need to have a look at your tongue, Mr. Dragon. I hope that's alright. I feel like that's the same. That it looks the same as the one we saw in Farron Keep. Yeah. So, I don't know. Like, I do still feel like this one doesn't look as brown as the other one does. The other one looks very brown, but it does have the fur. Neither the teeth nor the tongue are petrified. It has the ash coming off of it, which the other one clearly doesn't have. And we can also see that the ashes look a lot like the death animation, which looks in turn like what we see when the Firekeeper baptizes us with ash after having returned all the lords to their thrones. Which looks different, I think, as we discussed in the previous episode, to the feather effect that we see from the blessed attacks by the mangrubs, but this looks more gray. When we kill enemies, the ashes that float up, they look exactly like these particle effects, but they're white, and this is very gray or brown. So I don't know. I don't have the slightest clue, but I'm interested in hearing what everyone thinks. Don't mind me. Okay. So we got the lift chamber key.
Key to the room of the lift that descends to the deepest dungeon in Lothric. A surviving Darkwraith from the land swallowed by darkness is said to be held there. So if we had done this as soon as we got the key, this would have been the first Darkwraith we had seen in the game. It was given to us, of course, by Leonhard, the Ring Finger. Recall that in the previous episode, JSF had this to say.
Like, we were talking about epitaphs before, and I mentioned that there was an Outrider with an epitaph. That Outrider was originally in the cell where you fight the Darkwraith now.
Oh, interesting.
That's in, like, the beta test footage you can see around YouTube if you look at people who played the beta. It's down there, and that makes a lot more sense when you think about it, that they would have an Outrider hostage in Lothric.
As opposed to just a
because there are Outriders attacking Lothric Castle at the same time, so they've kept a guy prisoner. Makes sense. Darkwraith doesn't really make that much sense at all. It seems like they just put it there because they needed the red eye orb.
But yeah, with all that in mind, like, the way it was originally in the network test probably would have made a little bit more sense. Doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense for this Darkwraith to be here, beyond, you know, we need to give the players a full eye orb early in the game. We have all these Lothric soldiers here that aren't Lothric soldiers. They don't have heads, which is a theme we've discussed and that we will return to when we go to Lothric Castle proper. But yeah, they appear to have all turned to ash. Because there's nothing in the armor. So again, they ragdoll in Dark Souls 3 pretty much in the exact same way that they did in Dark Souls 1, notwithstanding the broader differences in the physics engine. Red Eye Orb, online play item. Invade other worlds at will. Defeat the host of embers of the world you have invaded to gain the strength of fire. An act that Cirrus referred to as cordial intrusion. I should have mentioned that earlier. The Red Eye Orb is rooted in a tiny land swallowed by darkness long ago. Some choose to put the orb to other uses. To embark on this path, enter the service of Rosaria in the Cathedral of the Deep. So if we had come here right after getting that key, we wouldn't necessarily know who Rosaria is. So it's interesting. And just once again to see that there's nothing in these armor sets here. Which is very odd. But yeah, we'll return to that later. So we have a little bit left to do here before we move on. Starting with this item over here. It's just purple moss clump. And several items in this direction. Iron flesh. I believe there's a fun with definition segment associated with that item. Pyromancy that internalizes flame. Iron flesh boosts damage absorption and resistance, but significantly increases weight. Not advisable for walking in marshlands, perhaps resulting in its obsolescence in the Great Swamp. So there are, in fact, two different words to cover here in our next Fun with Definitions. The first being marsh, which is an area of low-lying land that is flooded in wet seasons or at high tide, and typically remains waterlogged at all times.
And the second being obsolescence, which is the process of becoming obsolete or outdated and no longer used. So suggesting perhaps that at one point the Great Swamp wasn't a marsh. It wasn't an area of low-lying land that is flooded in wet seasons or at high tide and typically remains waterlogged at all times. I wonder. Again, I don't know whether it's possible maybe we're looking too deeply into the item descriptions. I don't think that's true, but, it's possible. But for something to become obsolete, because that's what obsolescence is, it's basically just to become obsolete. It would have needed to have a use there at some point. Suggesting that you didn't need to walk through the marshlands at one point at the Great Swamp. Suggesting, perhaps in turn, that it was once named something else, but again, I don't know. Oh no.
I have any time.
Yes!
I have
You certainly do, friend.
any time.
Oh, you're the best.
I have any time.
That you do. Oh. Thank you, friend. You're the best.
Any time.
Okay, so pick up a young white branch, Crown of Dusk, and another young white branch. Ember. Gold pine bundle. So I think we've got all the items now. Because, yeah, we dealt with all that in the previous episode. So let's get to non-poison land. So, Crown of Dusk. Feathered crown bestowed upon the Princess of Ulasil, land of ancient golden sorceries. Through the Guardian Elizabeth's blessing, this raises the power and effect of the wearer's magic, but damage suffered by magic attacks rises in tandem. It's now a couple days later. It's Sunday the 19th of March, and I hope you're all still having a fantastic day whenever it is you find yourself watching this. I was pretty pooped to the point where I wasn't sure if I was making sense anymore, so I've learned that that's usually a good sign that I should stop recording and just pick it up another day. I do realize that there are a number of item descriptions that we've yet to read, and we will get to those very shortly. But he was just helping us any time. What happened, friend? So yes, just to review, even if John Grimm hadn't come to visit I Help Anytime, we sealed his fate as soon as we picked up the items that were surrounding the third white branch tree. Or white birch tree, I should say. At which point he dies. And I don't know why. So it's interesting that you see that they actually added physics to his chains, such that even after he's dead, they still sort of sway in the wind. But either way, I'm sorry, friend. I really am. All you wanted to do was help, and help anytime, and you did, until now, so rip. Hawkring, ring associated with Hawkeye Go, one of the 4 knights of Gwyn, the First Lord, extends the range of arrows. In his later years, the giant Go was blinded, but this did not prevent him from striking down a calamitous dragon with his great bow. So once again, we're seeing this theme recurring over and over and over again, of history repeating itself, but with slight differences, of legacies of people trying to live up to the legacies of the legends of yore, even if they don't have an understanding or appreciation for the context of the legends that they're trying to live up to, as well as the motivations of the legendary figures they're trying to emulate. And this is one such instance of that, because when Go's work was finished, when he finished striking down the calamitous dragon, that is Black Dragon Calamite, he didn't just die. He sort of was resigned to his new life of just carving carvings.
There's very little to be said. What good is a dog with no hairs to hunt? But I'm lucky to be alive, I suppose.
And you'll notice that the voice
Help me.
is not coincidentally that of Hawkeye Go. I'm sorry we only have Help Me right now, and that's the only one I can demonstrate this with, but this is very much Hawkeye Go's voice.
Help me.
So he was content with just living out the rest of his life doing that, working basically on arts and crafts, which, good for him, after being a member of Gwyn's 4 Knights, sort of his elite group of knights. Not at all dissimilar to that which we find in this game. Lothric has its own sort of elite group of knights, a couple of whom we've already met, but we'll return to that later.
Farewell, proud human. May every honor be bestowed upon thee.
And again, you know, it's unclear what his motivations were. We discussed, I think, in episode 10, the possibility that he might have escaped from Anor Londo and come here, set up shop up here for some reason. We don't find Go in a tower, but we do find him in a place it doesn't really make a lot of sense for him to be, because I suppose he could have made it up here. Like, it's hard to say. Like, maybe if he went sideways and sort of squeezed his way through. This is very reminiscent to one of the towers we find in Upper Sense Fortress, the tower which overlooks the Iron Golem boss room, and atop which stands a giant, not unlike I Help Anytime. Whereas I Help Anytime has been liberated, he's seemingly liberated himself. The giant on top of this tower chucks firebombs at you, giant firebombs at you while you're fighting the Iron Golem, unless you kill him first. And there, as with here, and as with Hawkeye Go, it's unclear as to how beings of this size would squeeze into the tiny spaces required to get up here, save for the possibility of some flying creature having dropped them off at the top. But again, as kind and as wonderful and as awesome as I Help Anytime is, there isn't a whole lot of deep thought going on in him doing the things that he's doing. he is probably the personification or the embodiment of what I've been saying throughout this episode, of unthinkingly sort of attempting to emulate and live up to these legends of yore. Hawkeye Go is a very eloquent giant. He is very introspective. Certainly he's had a lot of time once we meet him in the Artorias of the Abyss DLC. He's seemingly been in prison there for a while, and blinded, whether in terms of his eyes no longer working or just that his helmet has been packed with resin. That's a whole thing, but we don't really have time to go into it here. But yeah, again, the legacy that he's living up to is much more complicated than his actions in this game would otherwise suggest. So in terms of his purpose, as best as we can tell based on the fact that he dies when we collect the items surrounding the 3 white birch trees, is that, yeah, he was protecting the trees. I don't know why he thinks it's okay for us to grab these items. A young white branch used to transition into something which blends into the surroundings. Little Dusk's sorcerer's staff eventually became a seedling, and then 3 white birch saplings. The young branch is said to still contain echoes of Little Dusk's capriciousness. So we don't find those items on corpses, we find them at the base of these trees, suggesting that we're snapping branches off of the trees. If he's protecting these trees and considering them sacred objects, then why doesn't he get upset at us for breaking off branches? Again, I don't know, but it could just be, once again, that he's not really thinking all that much about it. He's just, he's helping anytime and doing a great job of it. So, yeah. We'll probably return to talk more about I Help Anytime later, at some point anyway, as we further explore the giants and their role in this game and how poorly the giants have been treated. Like, really horrific stuff that we've seen in all 3 games. Really, really, truly horrific and awful. And yet, yeah, I Help Anytime is willing to help us anytime. So yeah, rip, friend. Okay, so turning to the items that we've accumulated but not, the descriptions for which we've not yet read. So the first was the lightning spear, because I was distracted by crystal lizards, so apologies for that. Miracle allegedly used by warriors of sunlight. Hurls a lightning spear. The spears inflict lightning damage, providing an effective counter to magic or fire, especially powerful against metal armor and dragons. So we found this item right in front of the petrified or frozen in time dragon on top of the old Wolf of Farron bonfire, where we were earlier in the episode. The placement of this item is obviously meant to convey a story, and that is, as it points out in the last line, that it's especially powerful against metal armor and dragons. In particular, the dragons. Lightning was the key to peeling apart the stone scales of the dragons, as we learned in the intro cinematic to Dark Souls 1.
With the strength of lords, they challenged the dragons. Gwyn's mighty bolts peeled apart their stone scales. The witches weaved great firestorms. Nito unleashed a miasma of death and disease. And Seath the Scaleless betrayed his own, and the dragons were no more.
And we had a comment by Mothmantis0708 which touched on this miracle. And we'll address the rest of this comment later, but for now, where it says 112, referring to, I believe, an hour and 12 minutes into the previous episode, Mothmantis writes, almost directly above you is the corpse of a dragon, and next to the dragon is the sunlight spear miracle.
and it almost seems like the dragon destroyed the bridge by crashing into it, having been killed by a warrior of sunlight, based out of Lothric, judging by the enemies and the nearby blue shield, that is the Dragon Crest shield, who was camping directly below the bridge where we find his talisman. So really, a really clever placement of items that I never noticed before, so I thank Moth Mantis for bringing this up. And just to clarify, it's not the Sunlight Spear, which is a much more powerful version of this one. It's the Lightning Spear. Next we have the Gold Pine Bundle. Rare pine resin which emits golden sparks, collected in a small bundle. Quickly applies lightning to right-hand weapon. Does not last for long, but can be used in inventive ways, such as applying it in the middle of a series of blows. So there's nothing especially interesting about this item description, per se, but we did find it in close proximity to several other items which relate to Oolacile. And I don't recall exactly how this was handled in Dark Souls 2. I believe you could at a certain point of the game buy unlimited gold pine resins, but in Dark Souls 1, gold pine resins were, I believe, the only pine resins in the game that you couldn't buy in infinite supply. They were incredibly rare. You could buy a few from Dornhall of Xena. I think I'm saying that name wrong. I can never remember. I can never remember that NPC's name. But you can only buy a few off of him. You can buy a few off of, I believe, 5 from Elizabeth of Oolacile. And there are a couple other drops where you can pick up. But the only way to sort of get more than that in a given playthrough is to farm the adult mushrooms, the big mushrooms we were talking about in the previous episode. So, again, even though it's not in the text of the item description itself, the place where we find it, and the fact that it's similarly proximate in Dark Souls 1 to several other items that relate to Oolacile, is something worth noting. We also got the Lingering Dragon Crest ring from the crab that I Help Anytime very kindly helped us kill. A special ring given to those who are deemed fit to undertake the journey of discovery in Vinheim, home of sorcery. Extends length of spell effect. Apropos to the Dragon School, the seal depicts an everlasting dragon. A lingering dragon symbolizes the true nature of the consummate sorcerer. So I may or may not have mentioned this earlier because it's entirely possible that I cut this out because I think my first recording session was close to 2 hours, and if I recall correctly, the edited together first portion of this episode is something like 1 hour and 15 minutes. So I may have cut it out, but this ring was sold in Dark Souls 1 by Greggs of Vinheim. But yeah, for now, let's head back to Farron Keep. So finally, something like 2 hours after we have opened this door, we're finally going through it. So just as we saw earlier when discussing Sif and the old Wolf of Farron, and the preponderance of swords being sort of stuck into the ground, and in this case, judging by the presence of the candles, if in Dark Souls 1, the swords in the ground were meant to be sort of a warning to those who would try to defile the apparent grave of Artorias, these swords would seem to have been stuck down here in a show of respect for either the Abyss Watchers or the old Wolf of Farron. Or maybe this too is just a way of saying, hey, stay out of here. You really don't want to be here. We also had some really good comments which touched on the flame altars and their significance in opening this door, but we'll get to those a little bit later on. We see here a Corvian storyteller. Preaching to not the most captive audience of Corvians, but they're in such rough shape and so far away from home that I can't say I blame them. Or at least this one isn't especially interested in what's going on. The other three do actually seem to be a captive audience. Oh, every time I see the corpses, I feel so bad for them. These ones are holding up their great daggers, I think they're called. Oh, are they cool if the storyteller doesn't incite them? Hi, friends. I hope your worship's going well. I'm very sorry for killing the worship leader, but I hope you understand that I meant no harm. Just trying to make a YouTube series here about the lore of the game. So thank you for your cooperation. I very much appreciate it. Sorry, friend. That does not look pleasant. So, Shriving Stone, we found our first Shriving Stone on the Road of Sacrifice is the spot that had all of the Corvians. So the Shriving Stone looks very, very similar to the gross that we find on the end of the Storyteller's Staff. I presume that was intentional. But yeah, I didn't know that if you killed the Storyteller that they would not be hostile, so that is very good to know. So whereas up to this point, we've only seen, if we can borrow the naming convention from the demons, we've only seen stray Darkwraiths. We've not seen any Darkwraiths sort of acting in concert with one another. Wow. They got wrecked pretty badly there. Oh man. Alright, we're gonna go light the bonfire. And then there are some items that they dropped over there, so we're not gonna sit. We're gonna go get the items before we sit. We do have a couple of NPC summons here, and I actually haven't even thought about how we're gonna handle that, so this should be interesting. Because yeah, you can only summon one of the I think 2 or 3 NPCs that are here. Insofar as there's 3, I don't believe we've met the conditions to summon the 3rd one. But I could be wrong about that. It's an ember. That was from the corpse that's there and not the Gru that dropped it. Wow, so they all pretty much took each other out. Look at this pile of bodies here. Oh my gosh. So, cracked red eye orb, dark sword, and this is... So we were talking about elite knights earlier. This is Black Hand Gotthard. who we'll talk about in a second. Pitch Black Straight Sword of the Darkwraith, survivor of the land swallowed by darkness. The Darkwraiths were the first Red Orb invaders and originators of a unique sword technique inspired by their thick, broad blades. So I assume that's referring to the Stomp skill, which is used by a number of weapons in this game, I believe including the one we're using right now, yeah. And apparently that was originated by the Darkwraiths, using the Dark Sword, so that's pretty cool. You can even see the pattern of overgrowth that is happening. You can see it on the sword itself, and that is a fascinating little detail that I've never noticed. But that seems to be a much more general theme that we're going to explore a little bit later on. So we have a few more grooves up here. And black bug pellet. So I believe this is the first that we've seen of this. Medicinal pellet made from crushed insects. The black type temporarily boosts dark damage absorption. At all times, the Abyss Watchers of the Undead Legion keep a supply of these concoctions prepared by the Acolytes. Rumor has it their Gru descendants still make use of these concoctions. So I believe this is the first item that outright tells us that the Gru are descendants of the Abyss Watchers of the Undead Legion. So yeah, that's that for this part here, notwithstanding the boss fight, which we'll deal with. Let's open the door so that we don't have to deal with that afterwards. So yeah, we're going to leave that for now, because there are a couple items we have to get over here before we deal with the boss fight. And we have 10 flasks, so we might actually be able to do this without refreshing, but one of the items we have to get here requires us to drop down, so we might as well just... Let's see if we can get Hand Gotthard to help us, actually. So I've never noticed before, just in thinking about the particle effects, these look very different from the particle effects that we see with the death animations that are coming off of the dragons and the high wall of Lothric, which looks different in turn from the feathers that we see emitted from blessed attacks. So for a second, my thought was, in looking at this, oh, maybe this is how we tell whether the summon sign belongs to an unkindled or not, but they look different. So in the previous episode, and we'll deal with this because we have a comment that deals with this, and I want to clarify some of the things I said in the previous episode about the Ember item description and the test that I proposed to figure out who is unkindled and who isn't based on the summon signs. So I described it just as a test in general terms, but of course I should clarify that it's not a negative test, it's a positive test. So that is to say that the only people in the game to which we can apply this test are those who leave summon signs for us to interact with. So even though that should give us an idea, whenever there's a summon sign, if we use an Ember and the summon sign appears, then that person is almost certainly unkindled if we're taking the item description at face value. If you see a summon sign that appears when using an Ember, or alternatively when using Seek Guidance, that summon sign belongs to someone who, again, if we're taking the Ember item description at face value, that person is unkindled. But we can't say go to someone in Firelink who doesn't leave a summon sign anywhere and test that person to see whether they're unkindled. This only works with the people who leave summon signs for us to interact with. But yeah, we'll return to that later. So buy my sword. I want to say that that is some sort of display of chivalry or something. Because we can see that he's no slouch. He's got fancy gear, fancy sword, fancy hat, fancy name. Equally as socially awkward as the rest of the NPC summons, but that's okay. We won't hold it against him. We're gonna go see if he can help us with this ravenous crystal lizard over here. This is called Farron Keep Perimeter, this bonfire. And this is the other side where we found the emergency exit that leads from the upper swamp to where we are right now. I believe he's using a composite bow. Yep, that's a composite bow, which I believe scales equally with strength and dex. And the weapon he's using, which will... Relax, dude, they're dead. Oh, you're poisoned, though. You better deal with that. Dude, what are you doing? Relax. I think you're fine. You're good. You're good. You're good. Okay. Well, I'm gonna hope you have enough HP to withstand that. Do we want to see if we can kill the ravenous crystal lizard by himself? I think we do. Maybe not. Maybe if he wasn't poisoned first. This one is obviously a fair bit stronger than the one that we find at the Cemetery of Ash. Again, the particle effect there different than the one we just saw in the summon sign, so that's worth noting. This is where our friend the Black Knight is from earlier, and this is the emergency exit that I was talking about, the fire exit. Or someone could just come and open that up, and then everyone would just come flooding into the Farron Keep. So, yeah, not the best security measure.
We also have Great Magic Weapon. Sorcery which improves upon magic weapon. Greatly reinforces right weapon with magic. Only sorcerer swordsmen with special duties are permitted the use of this spell. The Azure Blade is said to cut down heavily armored knights with ease. So if we turn to our next fun with definitions, we learned that azure means bright blue in color, like a cloudless sky. Indeed. In terms of nouns, it could also mean a small butterfly that is typically blue or purplish, with color differences between the sexes, which I suppose could apply to the moonlight butterflies that we met in Dark Souls 1, but that might just be a coincidence. Not entirely sure. So we do have another summon sign here. Same particle effects with this one. So we're going to use that one after we get these items here. Actually, first let's go... Let's say hello to the Black Knight. So I've said this before about parrying, and it bears repeating here. Some days, you just don't have it, and you just gotta let it go, and not continue parrying, banging your head against the wall, essentially. And that's not something I did there, so... something to consider. If you are trying to parry, some days, yeah, your timing's just not there. It obviously depends on the enemies you're fighting. Okay, I guess lycanthrope patrols. And we just missed the patrol? Not sure. Okay, with that said, I'm going to try parrying him once, and if it doesn't work, then yeah. Yep, didn't work. So the sound is still there. Oh, Black Knight Shield. The sound is still there, but the animation is different. And if we look at the shield, it says, Shield of the Black Knights who roam the lands. A flowing canal is chiseled deeply into its face. Long ago, the Black Knights faced the Chaos Demons and were charred black, but their shields became highly resistant to fire. So you can't parry with this one, unfortunately. Otherwise, I would use it, but... yeah. Okay, now let's go get those those items we should have got. Before I had the ill-advised idea to want to do another Black Knight comparison when it wasn't necessary. So we got Atonement and Hollow Gem. So two very, very, very important item descriptions. Let's go back to the bonfire before we read these. Okay, so first and foremost, we have Atonement. Miracle given to those cast out from the Sable Church of Londor. Attracts more attention from foes. This is the only tale known by the exiles, who believe it carries words of forgiveness. Cursed journeys, too, must ultimately come to an end. So I don't fully understand what it is we're looking at here. But it is very, very interesting. And I suspect will play a role in helping us understand Lady Elfrida and what the story is there. And hopefully with the second DLC we'll learn even more about the Sable Church of Londor, but that remains to be seen. But perhaps more importantly, the Hollow Gem. A gem of infused titanite, a stone plentiful in Londor, land of hollows, used in infusion to create hollow weapons. Hollow weapons are said to peer into the essence of its wielder, whose luck boosts attack. So several things to note about this item and its description. So the first is that the rock, if you look at the gem itself, because it's called the gem, but I think it's probably more accurate to describe it as a rock, we see that the pattern it depicts is not at all unlike that which we find on the chest of hollows. As well as in the upper left-hand corner of the screen when we have the HUD on, it displays a hollow pattern which reflects the extent to which we're hollowed. So visually it's very similar to the physical manifestation of hollowing that we see. The second thing to note is the word essence, which, you know, it seems self-explanatory, but it's worth unpacking a little bit further. So if we turn to our next Fun with Definitions, we learn that essence means the intrinsic nature or indispensable quality of something, especially something abstract that determines its character. So even more interesting is the philosophical aspect of this, the philosophical subset of this definition, which states a property or group of properties of something without which it would not exist or be what it is. So I don't know to what extent I want to go into this today, but the implications that emerge from this are both very interesting, problematic, and curious at the same time, because it's essentially saying that without luck, humans in this game would not be humans. That luck is the essential property of humanity. But it is worth noting the how really, really important this word, at least in the English text of this item description, that this implies a lot of things about humanity. That hollow weapons are said to peer into the essence of its wielder, whose luck boosts attack. So the essence of its wielder. So without luck, humans would not be who they are. Humanity would not be what it is. It would no longer be humanity. So that's what essence, at least as far as I'm concerned, means or ought to mean in this context with the way this item description is phrased. But with all that said, we had a summon sign here, and it's no longer there, which means, based on our test, that whoever this is an unkindled. And it's the Londor Pale Shade.
Thank you kindly. So we can see that they're using the sword that we would have gotten from Yuria had we killed Orbeck, as well as using the Dark Hand in her left hand. So it could just be that the Phantom models are lower in their polygon count than otherwise, or that I'm experiencing some depth of field blurring here that is obscuring where the eye should be, but it doesn't look like the Londor Pale Shade has any eyes. Either that or her eyelids are shut for no apparent reason. So why are the Darkwraiths here? I suppose the easiest explanation for that would be that they are attracted to the Abyss. That the Abyss Watchers are guarding the entrance to not only the I guess death place of the chaos, but also to the Abyss, which again was similarly proximate in Dark Souls 1. So it's not a surprise that we find them here. The Darkwraith being in the dungeon, as we mentioned earlier, probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and it's kind of hard to explain. So I mentioned earlier about the characteristics of the Dark Soul, and how the humanity sprites are drawn towards people and things. Drawn towards souls, I think, more precisely. And notwithstanding the weird glitching that is happening here, that is what we're seeing reflected in Affinity, or I believe in the Japanese text they're still called Pursuers, as they were in Dark Souls 1. But in Dark Souls 3, I think they're called Affinity, just as they were in Dark Souls 2. So yeah, so the Darkwraiths appear to be attracted to the Abyss. And they appear to be heading headlong into a confrontation with the Abyss Watchers, except for the fact that even though we opened the door, they just sort of stand there and stare. That's all they do. So, very cool set piece until you try to break it, and then it breaks. So maybe they had something else planned here, that we were gonna walk into a fight, not only of the Gru versus the Darkwraiths, but of the Abyss Watchers versus the Darkwraiths. That would have been really, really, really cool. Because that is, as it stands now, even though and that's why we opened the door. We opened the door so that they would just be able to waltz right in, and yet they just stand there. So that's kind of disappointing. But what are you gonna do when you live in a shoe, I guess? Not bad. Not bad. Thank you, friend, for helping out. I'll pull the other one for you. Friend. She was deep in thought about something there. Is that the heretic staff? I'm hoping we get to read that item description later, because it looks very similar to the staff that is used by Witch Beatrice in Dark Souls 1. But I'm not entirely sure about that. So that sound, I don't believe, persists after the Abyss Watchers have been defeated. So what we're hearing right there is the sound of them killing each other in perpetuity until we intervene. And we'll discuss the reasons for that shortly, but yeah, it's worth keeping in mind that just in general throughout Dark Souls 3, there's a lot of really clever sound design that gives you clues as to what's going on. And on that note, I will also point out that, as several people have pointed out, we'll talk about 2 such examples shortly, but the music for the Abyss Watchers, much like many of the other bosses, contains several clues as to the nature of the boss themselves. So, yeah, let's watch and listen closely during this boss fight for some of those clues. Thank you for your help, friend. And rip Abysswatchers. So, I was trying to get them to attack each other in the first phase, but I think I screwed that up by summoning for the boss fight because, yeah, their attention was split. The idea being that the third enemy that spawns during the first phase, whoever the third enemy is, and this ties into the whole question of whether or not the red eyes actually have lore significance or whether they're solely a gameplay thing or to what extent there's an overlap between those two things. But whenever there's a third one that spawns with red eyes, the Abysswatchers become hostile to each other. So we'll explore the reasons for that in a minute, but first, Soul of the Blood of the Wolf, one of the twisted souls steeped in strength, used to acquire numerous souls or transposed to extract its true strength. The blood was spread amongst the Abysswatchers, and their souls are one with the soul of the Wolf Blood Master. And if we zoom in really closely here, I suspect that we'll see what is suggested by this item description, that the blood was spread amongst the Abysswatchers, and their souls are one with the soul of the Wolf Blood Master. So this is not just one soul, these are many souls that we're holding right here. The next thing is that we also picked up our first Cinders of a Lord. Cinders of a Lord left by the Abysswatchers. If the Lords will not return to their thrones themselves, let them return as cinders. The Watchers of the Abyss swore upon their shared wolf's blood, which also served as their mandate as Lords. So what is happening here? I don't have a full explanation, but a partial one that has to do with a lot of the things that we've been talking about up to this point in this episode. So starting first with... So this is a paper from 1988, and despite its age, it's the paper that... the first paper that I read which really helped me understand this idea of history as a means of extending one's influence into the past. So I'm obviously not going to read the entire paper, but there's one paragraph that I wanted to share with each of you, which might help you understand what I was talking about earlier in the episode when I kept referring to, making history as a way of, extending one's influence into the past and attaching oneself to the legends of yore as a way of sort of giving oneself more authority in the present. Smith writes on History of Psychology and Present-Centered History. It is convenient to begin with a criticism that has become a cliché about textbook history of psychology. Texts assume a direct line from the past towards the present, awarding praise for contributions to progress. In this way, they contribute to the normative framework of psychological communities. History texts embody, and hence transmit to students, values important to psychologists' sense of worth and identity. In portraying modern psychology as the inevitable or natural outcome of the application of scientific procedures to psychological topics, they give modern psychology its authority. The student experiences what it is like to inherit a uniquely objective and hence instrumentally effective endeavor. This is a familiar analysis for the history of science generally. The dangers of this are also now well known and need not be rehearsed at length. The danger to psychology is that selective history privileges one body of knowledge and practice as truth, reducing the imagination's power to conceptualize alternative truths. There is thus a parallel between linear history and a positivist account of knowledge. Both exclude any other frame of meaning which might be a vantage point from which to criticize what the psychologist or positivist accepts as knowledge. The danger to history is that the perspective of modern psychology distorts and simplifies what have been far from inevitable events and circumstances. Further, this perspective presupposes a continuous subject, whereas questions about the identity and continuity of the subject should be integral to history's practice. So in other words, this is something that happens in our own world. Even though the subject of this particular essay is psychology in particular, this is true, as Smith suggests here, more generally in the history of science and still more broadly in history more generally.
So the Abysswatchers, for one reason or another, have aligned themselves with the legend of Artorias. So as was mentioned in episode 10 and in earlier episodes, Kassadin has several really excellent essays concerning Dark Souls 3 and its lore. And the one we're going to be reading an excerpt from today is Dream Chasers, a link to which you'll find in the video description below. So Kassadin writes, Artorias is a powerful name in the Dark Souls universe. Even amongst the fanbase, the name carries incredible weight. In Dark Souls 1, Artorias is enshrined as the Abysswatcher, one of the knights of Lord Gwyn himself and contemporary of Hawkeye Go and Kieran. In his legend, Artorias braved the void to rescue Princess Dusk and stop the encroachment of the dark upon Ulasil. His is a name that comes up time and time again as the chosen undead makes their own pilgrimage through Lordran. The legend of Artorias has already been established and the knight has already become larger than life, a myth. The chosen undead learns the truth buried by that myth. In truth, Artorias wasn't the man of unshakable will that the Wolf Ring of Dark Souls 1 and his legend describes. Artorias was consumed by the Abyss and destroyed by it, his left arm and sword cursed by the very thing he sought to stop. In a final act of desperation, Artorias sacrificed his great shield to protect his companion Sif. In the end, Artorias failed. The knight known as the Abysswalker was not the man the legends made him out to be. In fact, it is the chosen undead who, pulled through time by the influence of Menace, traverses the Abyss and saves the princess. Despite the fact that it is the chosen undead who defeats Menace and rescues Dusk, there is no one left to report the truth. Go remains imprisoned. Kieran stays behind to mourn Artorias' passing, and the chosen undead returns to their correct time. In the end, it is Artorias who is given credit, and it is Artorias where the legend of the first Abysswalker springs around. It is a legend that rallies a caravan of undead, that, as Hawkwood tells us, are desperate to believe that they are somehow special. Inspired by the myths surrounding Artorias, the Undead Legion of Farron becomes the heirs to Artorias' legacy and swear to contain the Abyss, as the Abysswalker is said to have done. Over time, the movement twists and becomes a militaristic cult, drawing on the myths and legends surrounding the chosen undead and the gathering of corrupted, in the minds of the Abysswatchers, Lord Souls, possibly Nito, the Witch of Izalith, and the Four Kings, all of whom had something to do with the Abyss. Ceremonies for admission are created and undergone by symbolically snuffing them out. There is even a version of transubstantiation within the Legion, as they partake of a Eucharist of the wolf's blood, which links the Legion together and forges them into a family. By the time of the events of Dark Souls 3, the Legion is characterized by its cultish zeal. Hawkwood tells us that the Legion will bury a kingdom at the first sign of exposure, and indeed, the masses have grown afraid of their would-be protectors. The distinctive helmet of the Legion is in their minds a sinister omen rather than a symbol of protection. Furthermore, in their twisted devotion, they ridiculed Hawkwood until he abandoned them for his insistence on fighting with a shield rather than with their specialized parrying dagger. They, as one, became Lords of Cinder to make themselves stronger and see their success as a mandate, their duty sanctified by the first flame. In their enthusiasm to embody the tenets they perceive in Artorias, the Legion lost sight of themselves. It isn't a surprise, then, that when the Legion came home and looked at themselves, they saw only abyss-tainted monsters in one another. The very thing they swore to contain and to combat revealed itself as a war of attrition they could never win. The Undead Legion were themselves infected, because the truth of the matter is, the legend of the Abysswalker is just that, legend. No one gets so close to the Abyss and comes out unscathed, no matter how strong they think their will and devotion are. In the end, when the Bell of Awakening roused them from their slumber, they became locked in a never-ending orgy of violence, killing one another over and over again, and turning their home, built as a fortress to contain High Lord Volnir and Karthus, into nothing more than a mausoleum, a monument to a dead dream. When the Ashen One encounters the Abyss Watchers, the Abyss's influence is strong, enough so as to attract the remaining Darkwraiths to the area. The Undead Legion are rising over and over again due to the Bell of Awakening that is audible in the score, and are forced to relive the horror of having to kill their infected brethren, themselves, and your character for getting too close. Defeating them proves to be a mercy. Their dream to do good was long subverted, and in the end, destroyed them. And Kassadin closes with a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, which reads, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." We also had a comment from Evan Wheat, who writes, "On the Abyss Watchers and thematic music, it's interesting to note the roles of the vocal parts in the Abyss Watchers theme, even aside from the obvious.
While the lone female lead is just a staple of Souls music, in this song it also suggests a lamentation, or in a medieval sense, a maiden singing the tragedy of the Watchers, like any other knightly tale, fitting as they find their origin in the fabricated version of Knight Artorias' exploits. The male chanting, meanwhile, evokes the marching of the Undead Legion itself, with strength, unity, and purpose. Phase 2 is the compositional clever bit, which has to have been intended by FromSoft. When the Wolf's blood unites, the chanting ceases, to emphasize that the Legion is no more. The strings, whilst less intense than at first, are still determined, taking the beat once held by the chanting. Goddamn, I think Yuka Kitamura is my favorite game composer next to Yoko Shimomura. I hope we take some time just to listen to the music in each episode where we fight a Lord of Cinder, because Kitamura did a fantastic job with each, except for Aldrich. I understand that recycling Gwendolyn's music is thematically appropriate, but is it really the right choice when Gwendolyn's theme was a grating annoyance to begin with? That's a good point in the last one, but yes, if I have comments with which to accompany a segment where we listen to parts of the boss themes, like this comment right here, then absolutely. My problem is I'm basically musically illiterate, or at least in part. So I don't know where to start in commenting on music other than just to say things like it's beautiful or it's very fitting for the boss and things like that. But as both Evan and Cassidy have pointed out, the bells in the theme, they mean something. As soon as the boss fight starts, as you'll recall from a few minutes ago, a bell rings, and then we see an additional Abysswalker rising from the dead. So, yeah, brilliant. Really, really brilliant. So again, if I have comments like this that deal with the music and how it fits the boss fight, I'll do my best to bring them up and also accompany that with the appropriate part of the boss theme. So I'm not sure that I have all that much more to add other than that until we look at the rest of the item descriptions, because I think that Cassidy's essay sums it up pretty well. That they built the Undead Legion on the basis of a false legend. That if you build something atop a foundation that is not solid, then it will eventually fall apart. And that happened here in a truly tragic and awful manner. That as the Undead Legion, and as this group, this caravan of undead that swore to contain the Abyss, swore to snuff out any signs of the Abyss's influence, that when they themselves became infected by the Abyss, they became defined by this sort of cognitive dissonance, where on the one hand they know that they need to snuff out any traces of the Abyss, but on the other hand they don't see the traces of the Abyss in themselves. They don't recognize that they themselves have been infected. So yeah, this is a theme that we've seen before, but with the way it weaves everything together between Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3, and the whole idea of the legend of Artorias and how that was played with in Dark Souls 1 with the DLC and played with here, brilliant. Like, I think just absolutely brilliant. And I know I've been very critical in this episode about a lot of things relating to Dark Souls 3 and FromSoft and, you know, things that are seemingly not done or unfinished, but I hope it's understood that I do that while keeping in mind that I really do love this game. And there are moments like this where I'm just so taken aback by what I've seen and thanks to the contributions of all of you out there, that I can, much better understand now than I did during my first playthrough, when I was just almost completely at a loss for words after having completed this boss fight. I didn't know what to think about any of this. So we see another altar there, presumably containing a goblet of wolf's blood. But I don't know that we can actually get close enough to it without, the altar moving to be able to verify that. But yeah, for now we're going to go back to Firelink.
Ah, well met, Ashen One. How may I be of service?
Undead Legion Helm, attire of the Abyss Watchers, the Undead Legion of Farron. These undead warriors vowed to partake of wolf blood. They acted in the dark, seeking out any sign of the Abyss, fighting a constant war with its abominations. This pointed steel helm was a distinct symbol of the Legion, shirked as a sinister omen by the masses. So the constant war that is being fought with the abominations. So that's the key in understanding why it is we find them fighting each other, because they themselves have become abominations of the Abyss. In the exact same way that it happened to Artorias. And the armor also points out that a black dyed leather vest is worn over the chainmail. For the gauntlets, black dyed leather is tied around the arms, with only the left fitted with a gauntlet. And the iron kneecaps originated from their sword techniques. So their techniques is something that's very interesting, something we're going to talk about shortly, but for now, it's worth keeping that in mind. We might as well pick this set up. I don't know that we're going to use it, but never hurts to have options.
Ashen One, be sure to bring more souls.
So, yeah. I think the trigger for Aegon showing up is defeating the Abyss Watchers. So we're not going to talk to him right now, but we will, of course, return to speak with him shortly. And by shortly, I mean in a future episode.
Aha, thou art returned, and a fine day it is. So, happened upon any twisted souls?
Wolf's Knight Greatsword. Greatsword of a knight tainted by the dark of the Abyss, and master of the wolf's blood of Farron. The Wolf Knight was the first Abyss Watcher, and his sword is more punishing against creations of the Abyss. The skill Wolf Sword. While in stance, use normal attack for a low spinning slash, or strong attack to leap forward in a vertically slashing somersault. We can also get the Farron Greatsword, Greatsword of the Abyss Watchers, which is atypically paired with an unusual dagger. The dagger is utilized as a wedge in the left hand, while the Greatsword is held in the right, a unique technique that was synonymous with the Undead Legion, confounds foes in the manner of wolves hunting prey. So I'm really torn in terms of which one of these we're going to pick up. I'm really torn, but given my affinity for the Artorias boss fight and Dark Souls 1, I think I'm going to have to pick up the Wolf's Knight Greatsword.
Now, do not be away over long.
So, in terms of the special moves, we have the Spinning Slash, as well as all moves that we would have seen in the introduction and throughout this episode while the clips of Artorias were on the screen. So, yeah, I don't know that we're going to use this right now. We do have 3 Titanite scales, but doing 221 unupgraded, which isn't bad. So, I don't know. We'll see. We do definitely want to use that at one point, but I'm not sure when that will be. But with all that said, I'm exhausted, so we're going to get to the comments, because we have quite a number to get to, and once again, I hope that you all understand if I don't get around to reading your comments. There are far too many that are worthy of being read, and we just simply don't have the time. So, with all that said, let's get started. So it occurred to me that, if only for the benefit of those of you who haven't actually played Dark Souls 1, that I should speak a little bit about the introduction that you saw at the very beginning of this episode, and that I've shown on the screen a couple times since then. First and foremost, I should note that the dialogue that is used in this scene, as it appeared in the introduction, was not in the original game. So that was something I added. The dialogue itself, I got from a YouTuber named Surfist, which, as has been noted in the video description to each episode of the series, all of the dialogue that you hear in these episodes that isn't a part of the game audio that's recorded when I'm capturing footage, comes from either Surfist or Moonlight Butterfly. My understanding is that Surfist takes the audio from the game files, whereas Moonlight Butterfly records it in the game itself. So they both have a different sound, and that's why I include both of their channels in the video description to every episode of the series, because sometimes they take it from Moonlight Butterfly's channel, sometimes from Surfist. It depends on what I need the dialogue for. Again, because they have a different sound because of the way that they both go about capturing that audio. So with all that said, yeah, the dialogue comes from Surfist. I don't know the context in which, and in fact I don't think anyone knows other than FromSoft, the context in which the dialogue was originally supposed to be used. I used almost all of the dialogue in the intro. The one thing that I didn't use was where he calls out to Sif.
Sif, there you are.
And the rest of it was, there was a bunch of grunts and stuff like that. It seems almost based on the grunts, like it could have been from the boss fight, but also that, because when we're attacking friendly NPCs, they have grunts like that. Or if you attack them, they go, oh! And, just to indicate, like, wait a second, this is not an enemy, this is a friendly NPC that you don't want to hurt. So it seems based on that, and I don't know to what extent that is actually really good evidence, but it seems based on that Artorias may at one point have simply been an NPC, or he may have spoken during the boss fight as I tried to recreate during the intro to this episode. So I don't know which of those two it is, or whether in fact even the dialogue is from the DLC. It might have been in the main game as well, because there were several things that were, as usual, planned for the main game that didn't make it into the final one. And that in this case, they rolled up all those ideas into the Artorias of the Abyss DLC. So this has been happening since the beginning. In Demon Souls, there's an Archstone, I believe, for the Land of the Giants or something like that, that is broken in the Nexus, which corresponds to an area that is not finished, and that wasn't finished before the game shipped. So again, just want to reiterate that it's not just that these things have been happening in Dark Souls 3, although in some ways they do appear to be more pronounced. But with all that said, returning to the intro once more, I added the dialogue because, I wanted to show you all something different, but also because I think it really adds to the pathos of the boss fight. It really does a good job of conveying the extent to which the legend of Artorias is a myth, and that's been the entire theme of this episode. So that's why I included the dialogue, in case anyone is wondering. The boss fight itself, I know it's not very good, but that was in New Game Plus, and I was fighting him without the HUD on. That was my first time fighting him in several months. Because again, that's footage that I had captured in 720p. In my casual playthrough, I did this exact same thing, but that was in New Game Plus, I think, with the same build. That was a new game, I think, with the same build. And but I had the HUD on, and I had Final Fantasy VII music playing in the background, so I wanted to capture it in 1080p for this series, as well as to do it with no HUD,
and with the original music. And I was quite pleased with the end result. I actually completed this introduction something like 2.5 months ago. That's how long I've had this planned. So I hope you all enjoyed it, and that it gave you an experience with that boss fight, if you've already played it, that you've never had before. In spite of the fact that, again, I know I missed a lot of hits, and there was a lot of backing up and healing, and bad dodges and things like that, but I also wanted to leave all of those things in to not only convey, again, the pathos of the boss fight, but also the extent to which Artorias is not at his best in that boss fight. He is not at his best. He's in really, really bad shape, and yet it's still a really, really hard boss fight. But yeah, I thought that the end result was a seemingly almost choreographed boss fight, with the exception of a couple parts where I clicked the analog stick to try and lock on, but the camera shifted, so I was pretty upset about that, but I was just so into the flow of the boss fight, and I didn't know how much HP he had left, so I just kept going until he was dead. And yeah, so first try, no HUD, New Game Plus, I actually managed to beat Artorias, which, if you had told me that like 3 years ago, I'd be like, oh, you're crazy, man. You're crazy. But yeah, that's that for the intro. If anyone has any questions about that or any comments, very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts. But I thought it would be an appropriate way of setting the stage for an episode in which we spent a lot of time talking about legacies, and there is no single legacy in the Dark Souls game that does such a good job of illustrating sort of the problems with history that I've discussed throughout the course of this episode, as well as the problems that we're seeing in Dark Souls 3. So I think that was, or at least I hope that it was a good way of framing the episode, and I hope you all agree. Athena Dark writes, I'm late to the party, but on different translations, when I teach different versions of the same book, or movie versus novel, etc., people struggle to accept that there can be more than one canon that are equal, but different, and the way around it is to point out that both, and go, look, it's different here, but it's the differences that are important, and this is why. So say Interview with the Vampire, in the novel, it's the death of his brother, but in the movie, it's the death of his wife. So the concept of love is very different, and in the book, Lewis is racked with guilt, but with grief in the movie. And both are right, but you have to be specific and say, look, this is what happens in this edition. So with the Japanese subtitles, they are important, and equally so as the English language version, but it's the differences between them that make them different, and both aspects have to be presented because the changes reflect a lot about the audiences they are intended for. So Anne Rice was okay with the overwhelming homoeroticism of her book, which had incestuous overtones, but the movie people weren't so keen on it and tried to tone down the homoeroticism to appeal to a broader audience. With the Japanese subtitles, there is the concept of culture as affecting language, not quite the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that is, we discussed Arrival and the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in that episode. So unclean in English means something very different to the same direct word in Japanese. A good example actually came up in Teen Wolf. They found a Shugendo scroll that told them to resolve a possession by a Nogitsune. They had to change the host, but the word change in Japanese means something very different to how they interpreted it as transform, that is, make into a werewolf. So changing the host meant get a new host, where they interpreted that as make the host a werewolf. Because of the context that they used the word change to mean, their jargon specifically altered the meaning of the word, and the concept of jargon as a personalized language for a small group is fundamental. So with Dark Souls, the linguistic definitions, which are fundamentally different, combined with the game's own jargon, means you get confused. When you translate, you make a lot of changes to make the words work in different language. So for example, Japanese is noun particle verb, where English is noun verb noun. We have very few particles. So you have to completely restructure the language to achieve the same meaning. But that means that it has two authors, the one who wrote it and the one who rewrote it. So you have to accept both as fundamentally equal, which causes problems because they might be contradictory. Which is where specificity comes in, so you can go in the Japanese translation and in the English version, we have this difference which can mean, which is exactly what you're doing. Well, thank you for noting that. Athena Dark continues, but it's really hard for people to get their heads around the idea that two contradictory ideas might both be valid, because in the West, we are taught that there are right and wrong answers, when often in this kind of work there are right answers and not wrong answers, and answers that are not supported by the text as it stands, but no outright wrong answers. It's probably easier to read Heptapod than to get that at first, to be honest. So yeah, that's really apt. I'm not sure that I have anything more to add than that, but I thought that last point about answers and sort of this mutually exclusive space in which answers and thoughts and opinions exist. So yeah, so I thought this was a really apt and well put comment. So thank you, Athena Dark. Evan Wheat writes, on the Stray Demon, is it possible that this mini-boss is genuinely living up to its name, being just a demon that got lost? I'll have to reread the soul description, but I don't believe there's a lore significance to its location. I would say it might have strayed out from the demon ruins through the catacombs, but A, on size alone, it wouldn't have got through the door at the Abyss Watchers, and B, the Watchers would have likely proven too formidable a border patrol. In fact, thinking of where it is quite comical. There's no way it could have climbed the ladder to ride the elevator next to the Wolf of Farron, so the only possible explanation was that the demon just got jumbled up in the convergence of the lands, leaving it not only stray, but stranded. I can imagine the poor demon going out for milk, eggs, and coffee at Lordran Mart, coming out of the store and being shocked to find itself stuck on a bridge in a swamp. So yeah, that's well said, and I wish that I had had this comment prepared earlier, because it would have made my very lengthy discussion of the Stray Demon much simpler. Even without looking at the Japanese text, Evan Wheat basically hit the nail on the head here, that the Stray Demon is simply a demon that is stray. And earlier in the episode, even though I put an annotation on the screen correcting myself, I was very confused about the fact that even though it was the Asylum demon in Dark Souls 1 that was the gatekeeper to Lordran, in Dark Souls 3, it's the Stray Demon that was the gatekeeper to Lothric. But of course, that's a completely moot point if we assume that the names are descriptive, in which case, Asylum Demon would mean that it is a demon in or demon of the Asylum. In which case, to answer your question, Evan, or to potentially answer your question, I would suggest that maybe, whereas Stray Demon is just the name of a demon who got lost, it could also mean that because it was once an Asylum demon, so if we look at the name Asylum Demon as a descriptive term, it was an Asylum demon, but there's no Asylum there anymore, or there's no gate to keep, because everything's been destroyed. So in that case, Stray would actually make a lot of sense, because it was a demon that had one job. Guard the gate, that's it. Don't let anyone get in, unless we say so. I don't know who's communicating with the demon like that, but just bear with me. So then the convergence happens, and the high wall shoots up out of the ground on top of everything else, and all these areas become separated that were once connected. The institution that so maybe instead of calling it the Asylum Demon, we'll call it the Institution Demon, or the Gate Demon. So the gate that the demon is guarding is no more. So therefore, Stray Demon. It doesn't have a purpose, it's stray. So, I don't know, that's the best explanation I can come up with, but I'm very much looking forward to hearing what everyone else thinks. Scion95 writes, I think it's almost safer to assume that the Ember item description is lying to us / flat out wrong, if only because of Yuria. Frida got kicked out of the Sable Church when she became unkindled. If Yuri is an unkindled too, there's a massive plot hole there, the size of the Dark Sign's sun. So, I don't have an answer for that part yet, other than to say we'll explore that when we get there. Just because I've never summoned Yuria. I've never I've done the Lord of Hollis questline, but not in the same way that I do things in this playthrough, where I 100% explore everything and load prior save states to go back and try other things and stuff like that. So for now, as I mentioned earlier, for now we're just gonna go under the assumption that just because I don't think it's necessarily safer to assume that the Ember item description is lying to us or flat out wrong, but, we don't really have anything better to go on right now, other than to suggest that the Ember reveals the summon signs of Unkindled. We only have a way of, if we find a summon sign, we only have a way of verifying whether that summon sign belongs to an Unkindled, is what I'm trying to say. We don't have a way of going into the world and, we can't pull out unkindled glasses and note whether the person we're looking at is unkindled. It doesn't work like that. So we're just working with what we have for now, and then we'll explore the possibility of Yuria being an unkindled and whether in fact that would constitute a massive plot hole when we get there. But I do have things to say about that, and I don't think it would necessarily be a plot hole. But yeah, we'll return to that later. Scion95 continues, I think you didn't understand my comment about Gwyn last time. When I said Gwyn trudged his way back to the kiln, I meant he trudged his way back to the kiln. As in he linked the fire, then ended up a dead Lord of Cinder in the Darkmoon Tomb, and then resurrected and went back to the kiln for the final boss fight.
Now, you might ask about how the heck Gwendolyn got Gwyn's body to shove it in the coffin, but I'd ask you the same thing about Aldrich or any of the other Lords of Cinder. My point essentially was that all of the Lords of Cinder, including Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, are shown to have tombs and coffins, and that we actually see 3 lords physically get up out of said coffins, as if they are buried after linking the fire. I don't actually know how. Like, was it something like Gwyn went with his Silver Knights, linked the fire, all of the Silver Knights got burned up and blackened, Gwyn walked back to Anor Londo and climbed into a coffin until we rang the bells of awakening and woke him up? I don't know, that seems weird and silly. So I absolutely agree that it seems weird and silly, and that's because, again, I don't think that's how it actually happened in Dark Souls 1. So to explain what I mean, let's look back at that excerpt from the Roger Smith paper I cited earlier. And in particular, let's look at the second last sentence in this excerpt here, that this perspective presupposes a continuous subject, whereas questions about the identity and continuity of the subject should be integral to history's practice. So, continuity, and I don't mean in the same sense that we've been talking about continuity errors throughout this episode. Well, to a degree I mean that, but on a more fundamental level, I don't think that at the time Dark Souls 1 was made, I don't think that a Lord of Cinder meant the same thing that it does in Dark Souls 3, because there was only one Lord of Cinder, and the name Lord of Cinder was meant as a way, as I understand it at least, was meant as a way of conveying the extent to which Gwyn has fallen. That he was Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, and then he became Gwyn, Lord of Cinder. So, when you say that, when I said Gwyn trudged his way back to the kiln, I meant he trudged his way back to the kiln, as in he linked the fire, then ended up a dead Lord of Cinder in the Darkmoon Tomb, and then resurrected and went back to the kiln for the final boss fight. So I did understand your comment, because that's the part I was disagreeing with. Because not only in the extra textual sense do I not think that Lord of Cinder meant the same thing in Dark Souls 1 as it does in Dark Souls 3, but also in the text of the game itself. And that is, the entire game of Dark Souls 1 is about us trying to pass all of these tests. All of these tests that are meant not only to give us access to the kiln, but to demonstrate that we're a worthy heir to Lord Gwyn. That when we get to the kiln of the First Flame, they're not going to just let anyone in. We need to first prove that we're capable of defeating Gwyn and linking the fire by collecting the Lord Souls, or at least enough of the Lord Souls to satiate the Lord Vessel. So Gwyn and the royal institution, whatever it was back then, because it's even though it's based on that, it's clearly not the same institution that has sprung up around Lothric in the present time of Dark Souls 3, if we can even use that term, present time. But it seems apparent to me that Gwyn set up all of these tests. He separated the powers across the land in a way that would make it really, really difficult to gain access to the First Flame. But that whoever did have the ability to gather all those things, to meet all the requirements, to face him in the kiln, that person would be a very capable opponent indeed, because of the nature of the tests that were set up. So, returning to Dark Souls 3, I don't understand, I can't myself wrap my head around the idea, even in Dark Souls 3, of lords linking the fire. I guess the Soul of Cinder is probably the thing that links those things together. That the Soul of Cinder, for one reason or another, began with Gwyn, and that's why the second phase of the boss fight is itself Gwyn. And I think that right there is sort of another demonstration of the extent to which not only did the linking of the flame get weaker every single time, as we explored in the first couple of episodes of the series, but that each successive person to link the fire was less important than the one that came before them. That there's less of those people in the Soul of Cinder than there is Gwyn. That Gwyn will always have that, at least at the point that Dark Souls 3 takes place, Gwyn will always have that 50% ownership stake, I guess, in the Soul of Cinder. Because, the second phase is all him. And so, you could look at that in a number of ways, but I think that is one way of sort of demonstrating the extent to which that when we find Gwyn in the kiln of the First Flame, that he is a shadow, even more so than Artorias. He's a shadow of his former self. There's no thinking, there's no feeling there, there's no strategizing. He just
He sees you. As soon as he sees you come through the fog gate, he lunges at you full speed. No hesitation whatsoever. So if you look at the pomp and the circumstance of everything that happens leading up to that fight with Gwyn in the kiln of the First Flame, every single thing there suggests to me that when Gwyn left Anor Londo to the kiln, he didn't go link the fire and then come back and sit on a throne like Ludleth does. That aspect of Dark Souls 3 narrative I don't fully understand, at least insofar as how it relates to Dark Souls 1 and 2. It seems to me like that is something that is new, not only in terms of the text of the game, but the extra text as well. So in looking at what the developers were thinking in Dark Souls 1 when they named Gwyn Lord of Cinder, I don't think they were thinking the same thing. So in other words, there's a discontinuity there. So returning to the Roger Smith article, when he speaks of continuity, what he's really getting at is historical discontinuity. And in continuity of terms. So the subject of that paper is whether or not the history of psychology has a subject, because for something to be a subject that goes across time, you have to make sure that the psychology you're talking about in the 20th century is the same psychology that you're talking about in the 18th century, which it's not. They're not the same things. That's just how history works. It's context specific. And in this case, the parallel there is that I don't think Lord of Cinder meant the same thing in the text of the game itself and in the minds of the developer in Dark Souls 1 as it does in Dark Souls 3. And all of that, in turn, is to say that I don't think Gwyn ever left the kiln after he first linked the fire. But I am, of course, open to having my mind changed on that, as with pretty much everything else. Yosaho writes on the flame shrines, or the flame altars as I was calling them. I think it is depicting the journey of the chosen undead. Hawkwood even said that they want to be special. And what could make them feel special if not mimic someone who is indeed special? The reason Seath doesn't show up is because the Crystal Sage probably won't be happy to have their god killed just for the sake of ceremony. Farron is an underdog here, so there is no choice but to follow Lothric's demands. So interesting, very interesting point. On Dusk of Ulasil, my first assumption was, well, Dusk isn't her proper name, then it must be some kind of title given to a princess of Ulasil. But later on, there's a description of Chameleon that said something like to cure her loneliness in Dusk Forest. So that could be where Dusk came from, because she is always alone in the Dusk Forest. Other than that, there is a novel I've read a while back using Dusk to symbolize fragile or fleeing, which could potentially be another hidden meaning in her name. A fragile remnant of Ulasil, or a fleeting girl of Ulasil. So fleeting makes sense. Fleeting makes a lot of sense if we consider the context in which we meet her in Dark Souls 1, and how, we help her free herself from a golden crystal column. Then we summon, and then she, asks us if she can help, or if we can help her, and we agree. And then she disappears, and we summon her. We see her again, we talk to her, then she's gone. When we go back in time, we find her in Manus' boss room after defeating Manus, and so yeah, then we summon her afterwards, and she thanks us and says basically she didn't see anything. So, fleeting girl of Ulasil, that makes sense. But I did want to make sure that I wasn't misrepresenting Yosaho by providing this clarification here, so thank you. Yosaho continues on the Ember. The Japanese version is those with strength of fire will see a sign. Just plain sign, not specific to anyone. And the line Seekers of Embers isn't much help either, because of this line in the Dark Souls 1 opening cinematic. Then from the dark they came and found the souls of lords within the flame, which in Japanese is, then they came, born from the dark, attracted by the fire, and discovered the soul of king. So maybe everything are drawn to fire by nature. Maybe the translation team wasn't aware of this and assuming Seekers of Fire / Ember equals unkindled. So yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure, but it's interesting to note that, insofar as the Darkwraiths we saw in this episode were drawn towards the abyss. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, I'll return to that thought because I'm still thinking that through. But Yosaho continues. Little side note: the Gru dog is Gru bastard spawn, which I'm translating from Guru no Otoshigo. Ingrid and the Abysswatchers share a lot of similarities from appearances to thought process. In my theory / headcanon, he is the one who founded the Abysswatchers. So that is one very, very interesting possibility, because Ingrid was one of the sealers of New Londo, who basically flooded an entire city, Noah's Ark style, except with the unflooding, which came at our hands, but Ingrid and the Sealers flooded the entirety of New Londo, killing women and babies, as we see with the ghosts in New Londo ruins, all in order to contain the Abyss. So the exact same thing, which is pointed out by the Abyss Watcher's helm, that it says they snuff out an entire kingdom at the slightest sign of exposure. So yeah, really, really interesting connection there. Mothmantis0708 writes, I think the Undead Legion initiation ritual is meant to be both representative of how the legend has been passed down, as well as a commentary on the politics of Farron. The four kings were originally selected by Gwyn and bequeathed their title and a shard of his soul, so they could better shepherd humans. We don't really know when the Crystal Sages began working with the Legion, beyond the nebulous long ago descriptor of the Sage's Cole, but we do know that the Sages are connected to the archives, and therefore Seath, so it would be easy to see how they would want to keep the Pale Drake out of their semi-public rituals. Very, very good point. In a similar vein, J. Murphy writes, I think the reason Seath isn't included as one of the fires that needs to be extinguished is that the Farron Legion was working with one of the Crystal Sages to develop the Farron sorceries. The Crystal Sages were preachers spreading knowledge of Seath's crystal sorcery to the undead. It would seem logical that they'd want to keep the fact that crystal sorcery will drive you insane secret, thus the need to erase Seath's part in the sating of the Lord Vessel. Very well said, thank you, J. Murphy. Mothmantis continues, this brings up another point I don't think I've heard much discussion on, which is whether or not Farron was a part of Karthus. It seems almost obvious that the Abyss the Undead Legion originally sought to combat the same Abyss unleashed by Volnir, but for all the lore discussion stuff, both areas I don't really think anyone's tried to tie the two together narratively. So I don't have an answer for you there, but that is something that I'm hoping we'll be able to explore in the coming episodes. In one of the 2 episodes we're going to do on Karthus, I'm hoping to have Mitchell on, and Mitch has, certainly done a lot more thinking about Karthus than I have. I'm open to hearing other answers to this question in the comments, and I'll try my best to get to them in the next episode, or the episode after that. But that is something, I have a couple of ideas on that, but nothing very good, so I'm just going to leave it at that for now, until we're able to, develop something a little bit better and more concrete. Candidate writes, about the stone Parma, you're thinking of the stone Great Shield, which was used by the stone giants in Darkroot. The Parma's from Dark Souls 2, and was used by the stone soldiers in Drangleic Castle, were a reference to a really surreal anime called Angel's Egg. You get the stone Great Shield to drop from the Elder Grooves, though. The obvious explanation for Irina having the tower key is because she was supposed to be the firekeeper for Lothric. The Grand Treachery seems to be a reference to the End of Fire ending, as Ludleth calls it, a grand betrayal. Although I don't quite know how to parse that. The bit about her frailty definitely doesn't seem to be referring to anything physical. Are you trying to say that the ashes are Hodrick's? I can't see how, since the ashes are the dead, and you can get those ashes before Hodrick dies. I do think that interaction is really interesting though. The Shrine Maid's clearly sounding you out and trying to figure out if you're worth recommending to Cirrus, and it's clear her whole pose as a grumpy nihilist is essentially just a coping mechanism to deal with the horrible situation she's in, similar to Aegon. So the Dream Chaser's ashes, I don't know what I was trying to say there. I feel like that's something that several months ago I had an idea of what was going on there, or at least I thought I did. And in the process of making that episode and since, it's just completely sort of gone from my mind. So, that's something we're going to explore later, especially Hodrick. But Candidate also notes that he was wrong about the Giants, and he very kindly provided, as I requested in the previous episode, a screenshot that shows what the Giants look like under their masks. So, the mask is part of basically the head model. You can't see the face underneath. And the same seems to be true with the Giants, who have normal humanoid faces, unlike the giant cervix faces, as I've called them, that we see in Dark Souls 2, as well as with the giant tree at Firelink, which, I still can't explain that. But thank you very kindly for providing this photo. That's very interesting. Delight of the Endless writes, I think that the Abyss Watchers designed the whole ritual of extinguishing the flames as a symbolic reference to the chosen undead's journey. Considering that the Abyss Watcher's duty was to protect the first flame, I think it's safe to assume their beliefs and rituals were possibly inspired by the history of the first flame. The chosen undead had to undergo a sort of trial by defeating the lords and obtaining their souls, so that she or he opening
so that she or he can open the door to the kiln. The aspiring Abyss Watchers had to symbolically kill the lords by extinguishing the flames at their shrines. Successfully doing so opened the door for them, so that they could become defenders of the first flame, as the chosen undead had done so many years ago. I didn't really care for the whole fire ritual when I first played this, because it seemed too much like a video game gimmick to make the area seem longer than it actually is. On the other hand, it does make sense that a band of genocidal zealots would want a trial to determine if potential members had the guts, pun intended, to join their cult. And if true, it would shed some light on the Abyss Watchers' culture. Also, how did the Darkwraiths get past the door before the Champion of Ash opened it? So I don't have an answer for your last question, because as with a lot of the scripted encounters in the game, you can, if you're in the right spot, you can just see the enemies just sort of standing there waiting for you to give them their cue for them to start moving. So yeah, a little bit of suspension of disbelief required there, but yeah. As for the rest of your comment, I think it's very well said. I don't know that I would so strongly say that the Abyss Watchers were meant to defend, or that they were keen on defending the First Flame. I think more, even though that's related to combating the Abyss, of course, it would seem much more that their motivations were directly tied to the legacy of Artorias, and to the specific heroism of him having apparently beat back the Abyss himself, and together with Sif, of course. 103rd Whatever writes, I'm pretty sure they won't appear in this episode, but I absolutely love the theory that the Abyss Watchers were founded by Kieran, given their fighting style using a dagger alongside a larger weapon, completely foregoing shields, level of armoredness, and generally because it actually gives Kieran some agency and not existing only to react to Artorias and the player. Delight of the Endless writes in reply that also if you sequence break and go to the untended graves before killing the Abyss Watchers, the Hornet Ring won't be there. It'll only spawn after the Abyss Watchers are dead. I found that one out the hard way. So I like this theory too. I think this is very interesting. Especially if we look at the item description for the Gold Tracer, the weapon that she would use, I believe, in her right hand. And it reads, curved sword used by the Lord's Blade, Kieran, of Gwyn's 4 Knights. Kieran brandishes her sword in a mesmerizing dance, etching the darkness with dire streaks of gold. So I think the brandishes her sword in a mesmerizing dance is very, very appropriate for describing the Abyss Watchers. In particular, the second phase, when we see that, the wolf's blood combining into the one body, the one host. And something that came to mind while watching it was, and this will sound silly, but that came to mind while watching it was the words of House Targaryen in A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. And that is, my first time watching it, I just noted the blood. But what we're actually seeing is fire and blood. So whereas with Kieran, it was, her primary weapon was gold and her secondary one was silver, we see with the Abyss Watchers in the second phase that it's fire and blood. And the way they fight is with a very mesmerizing dance. So yeah, very much just like Lord's Blade Kieran. So I do want to return and talk about Kieran, and there were several interesting comments that followed this one which discuss the extent to which Kieran actually had agency herself as a character in the story, or whether she was just doing things for, as was mentioned by 103rd Whatever, for the player or for Artorias, that she herself had no independent significance in the story. It was just with her relation to men that she was actually significant. So I do want to discuss that at a later date, but yeah, I just thought I would bring that up for now, in case anyone had any thoughts on that, for when we arrive at the Untended Graves and get the Hornet Ring. So that's probably where we'll have the in-depth discussion of Lord's Blade Kieran. But for now, just worthy of note that this is one possible origin point for the Abyss Watchers. Marchy March writes, I believe touch is simply a means for Irina, who is blind and therefore constantly shrouded in darkness, to feel grounded in reality through the warmth of another. She seems especially particular about Aegon's touch, when she's really at her breaking point. So I think touch is simply her solace, kind of like how someone may want to hold another's hand to help them cope with physical pain. I believe the exact quest trigger for Irina's suffering is not receiving the tome, but the player learning the miracles from the tome.
I'm not sure if that's supposed to tell us that Irina doesn't read them until we request learning the spells, but it's likely important to how the quest plays out. I'd like to note that when Aegon attempts to drink from his Estus, he finds it empty. This may indicate that he used all of it trying to cure Irina of whatever the player did, and that was why he halted his great escape with her so shortly after carrying her outside. So that was something I noticed in the previous episode as well, that I wanted to mention, but it just sort of got lost in everything else that was going on in the already enormous length of that episode. That every single time I fought him, because I did that fight 4 or 5 times while trying to capture footage for the introduction to that episode, every single time he tries to heal, even though he has 0 Estus. So it was a weird thing to me, and I didn't know what to think about it, but Marchy March, yeah, this is a really good suggestion. I like this a lot, that he was trying to give Irina the Estus to heal her, but yeah, it's also worth questioning from there whether or not Estus heals everyone equally, or whether it's something that perhaps, only really works for people who are tied to the bonfires. But then that gets us into talking about Estus soup and all that stuff, and we're running out of time, so I'll leave it there for now. Marchy March continues, I believe Irina carries the tower key because of its relevance to firekeepers. She later heads there after becoming a firekeeper, so perhaps she received it as part of her training to become one. This Firelink Shrine seems to serve as an actual temple or monastery of some sort, as we see the firekeeper praying before the cinematic before putting on her mask. The location might hold some significance to their training. I would like to note that Irina's ashes seem terribly deformed below the hand. This may be visually representing the disgusting appearance firekeepers typically gain that encourages them to cover up. The only exception to this would be the Fair Lady in Dark Souls 1, but she's already a god and might be an exception. Okay, so 2 things stand out about Irina's ashes. One, it says her frailty was worthy of a Kareem holy woman, so apparently Way of White holy women are characteristically frail/weak. Anastasia and Rhea in Dark Souls 1 are also described as saints, and they're pretty consistent with this description. Second, the last line specifically says that, and then she betrayed everything. I can only assume this would refer to her position as a holy woman or member of the Way of White in general, not much else that could be considered such a wholesome betrayal in context. So that suggests to me that the betrayal is a broader institutional one. It's weird that in the English item description it would individualize that betrayal so much, because, we also had candidate mentioned that, it could be with reference to the dark ending, to letting the flame go out as part of the betrayal. But how can she be blamed for that when she's just playing her part in the system as she was taught to do and as she's always wanted to do? So I don't know. But thank you very kindly, Marchy March, for speaking to that, because that's very interesting. Darth Lily writes, I think you learn a lot from a character's final words. The way Aegon said,
Irina, this bastard,
gives me indication that even when he referred to her as a failed firekeeper and was generally mean to her, he really cared about her, or at least that he was true to his duty of protecting her. More than that, the fact that his last words were her name tells me that she was very important to him. Yeah, very well said, very well said. Again, another thing I meant to bring up in the previous episode, but that sort of got lost in the details of everything that was happening, so I very much appreciate you guys bringing these things up. Centimeter Worm writes, on my first playthrough I considered all of the hanging sacks and growths from trees to be a sort of fantasy burls, to indicate how diseased and foul the swamp was supposed to be. So with the provided link, I found this image on Wikimedia Commons, and it looks gross, just being a real life thing. It's obviously not as gross as the ones that we see throughout Dark Souls 3, but the fact that it's real, it kind of creeps me out. But yeah, it looks about right. And if we turn to our next Fun with Definitions, we find, and this is from Wikipedia, it says a burl results from a tree undergoing some form of stress. It may be caused by an injury, virus, or fungus. Most burls grow beneath the ground, attached to the roots, as a type of malignancy that is generally not discovered until the tree dies or falls over. Such burls sometimes appear as groups of bulbous protrusions connected by a system of rope-like roots. Almost all burl wood is covered by bark, even if it is underground. Insect infestation and certain types of mold infestation are the most common causes of this condition. So an idea that just came to me as I was reading this right now, the rope-like roots. Could that be what we're seeing throughout the game, Dark Souls 3? In the eyes of the deacons, hanging out the back of the Darkwraiths, and all these other things. It's like a black hair. Could that be the rope-like roots that are tied to these burls, which are in turn tied to injury, virus, or fungus? I don't know, but
It's an interesting thought, or at least I think it is. Centimeter Worm continues, the associations with the Curse-Rotted Greatwood might be a possibility, but I think the Greatwood is unique in that it was born of a sacred tree in an ostensibly sacred place. The Greatwood's soul states that people used it to seal away curses because it was a spirit tree, which feels especially significant. It's possible that the settlers are sealing other curses in other trees, such as the one the Evangelist is praying at, but the Greatwood still feels like a unique case to me. I also wonder what sort of curses leaked into the Undead Settlement that the inhabitants were able to just stuff inside a tree. Perhaps there's a link between these curses and the bloodletting implications associated with the Cathedral of the Deep that I'm not seeing. Like, in order to get curses out, you need to burn or bleed somebody. The only curse we can suffer in Dark Souls 1 and 2 is the petrifying curse of the basilisks and Seath, so there may be other things that we don't encounter during our adventure capable of causing curses. So I would suggest not only going back to episode 10 and watching that, because I believe this is something that JSF explained in that episode, but more directly I would suggest checking out his video called The Bastard's Curse, because I believe that this is something he addressed directly in that video. Also, in regards to the Estus Flask shards, my assumption is that it essentially works a bit like fusing together pieces of hot glass. For each shard given, the actual size and therefore volume of the flask is increased enough for one more sip of Estus. Although considering that the Ashen Flask turns Estus cold and that both flasks are separate entities but are upgraded essentially at the exact same time, my theory may be hogwash. So notwithstanding the second point there, because I think that might just be a gameplay thing more than anything, but it's not to say that there's no lore significance to the Ashen Estus, because I think there is, but that the extent to which the player allocates Estus between one or the other, I think, is really hard to sort of tie into the lore. But as for your first point, I think that's great, and that provides a much more sensible image in my mind than that which I was trying to imagine in the previous episode. I don't know anything about glass blowing or anything like that, but, you know, if you, like, melted down the entire Estus flask and then used the additional shards to sort of, you know, recreate it with more volume, as Centimeter Worm points out, like, that makes sense. That makes sense, but it'd be cool if that were somehow reflected in the game when we were trading them in, but I can understand why it wasn't. But that's going to do it for this episode, so again, my sincerest apologies if I didn't get around to your comments. But thank you all very, very much for joining me, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.